we're ready whenever
good
you
morning.
are.
Good morning, everyone. I am welcoming you from Middlesboro, Kentucky, here on beautiful Main Street. We're so glad that you are attending this grant writing workshop with us. And we have three amazing presenters today. And so before they get started, I'm going to do a quick introduction. And I'm terrible with names, but I'm going to try to read this off the paper, so hopefully that'll be right. So I have Amanda LaFear, and she has been with the Department of Environmental Protection since 2006, and spending a majority of that time in the Division of Compliance Assistant in the Brownfield program, and eventually became the Division Director. Now in 2021, Amanda took on the role of Deputy Commissioner for the department, so lots more work for her. Now she has also served as the chair of the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, Brownfield Focus Group, and the vice chair of the CER-CLA and Brownfield Subcommittee. She earned her bachelor's degree from Brusca University and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Kentucky. Now, Amanda is a Kentucky native, originally from Falls of Rough, Kentucky, and she resides in Lexington with her husband, John. So we're glad to have Amanda here as a panelist. But we have two other amazing ones, and this is Lynn True, and she serves as the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Kentucky Brownfield Redevelopment Program. And she has worked for state government for 25 years, and her experience ranges from environmental inspections to local assistance and community outreach. And then now Eric would have to have a really interesting last name for me to try to say this morning, and that is Eric Isminger. Eric, I hope I didn't butcher that too bad. And now he serves as the coordinator of the Kentucky Brownfield program. He has worked in state government for over 23 years, and his experience ranges from environmental biology, site assessments, data analysis, investigations, and remediation oversight. So we are so excited to have them leading this today. Now, again, I'm Joni Bieber with Middlesboro Main Street. I'm so glad you're here. And now I'm going to go on mute, and let's enjoy this workshop. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, as Joni said, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Joni. Sorry to throw you some curveballs in terms of pronunciation first thing in the morning. It's not often you have a Lefevre and an Iseminger in the same panel. So, but anyway, I want to thank all of you for being here with us today, and thank Eric and Lynn as well. They are, some of our great staff here at the department that can really help communities and help them through grant writing and brownfield processes. And you'll learn all about what we do and some of the services we have throughout this presentation. So before we really get rolling, though, we have just some general housekeeping to attend to. Everybody's on listen only. If you have questions, there is a question and answer pane in your control box there. So if you would like to ask us a question, just throw it in there and we'll try to attend to it throughout the session. And definitely at the end of this presentation as well. So, just throw that in there. We'll be happy to answer those. We are recording this, and our materials will be available on our website. We have lots of grant writing materials outside of this to help you out. And of course, our staff is also here to answer questions should you have them. So on the agenda for today, we're going to give you a little overview of grants, the different types of grants, the process, funding sources and guidelines, basics of grant writing and grant writing proposals. So the typical components you'll see in most grants, especially federal grants, they tend to be fairly formulaic. They ask a lot of the same things, no matter if you're applying for an education grant or an environmental grant, and then some general grant writing tips that are just good form all across the board. Part two, we'll talk a little bit more. It's a much shorter part, but it'll talk a little bit more about what we do as a program in brownfields. A lot of folks, people don't necessarily know they're interested in brownfields until we talk about them, because they're just great ways to help you identify resources to help you redevelop communities. And there's quite a bit of support out there for you if you're interested in that. So today's presentation and our other great writing resources can be found on our webpage. We will likely send out this link after the workshop, so don't try to even write that down at this point. It would just be too hard. But anyway, so you'll get some follow-up information after this. So you know, you can take notes, but you know, don't cramp your hand too much. As Joni said, today's presenters are me. I'll be doing the most of the presenting, so sorry about that. But we're going to be talking about general grant writing, the first part of this. And then Eric and Lynn will come up and talk about more of the brownfield related items. So a little bit about our agency, if you're not familiar with DEP. Of course, we're charged with, you know, protecting human health and the environment within Kentucky. So we have a division of air, we have a division of water. Actually, it's division for air quality, division of water, and division of waste management. But we also have support agencies like the Division of Compliance Assistance, Enforcement, and our lab. But we provide different services depending on what part of the agency you're in. You know, we do environmental inspections, we do permitting, enforcement, that compliance assistance component, which is where I lived for most of my career in DEP. We provide education, training, and of course grant assistance like we're doing today, along with, you know, grants that we provide through some of our programs. Specifically, I spent most of my career within the Kentucky Brownfield Redevelopment Program. So we're here to assist communities and individuals in reimagining, redeveloping, and renewing properties to provide social and economic opportunities for the Commonwealth and its citizens. So, but how do we do that? Well, you know, we provide grant writing assistance like what we're doing today. So we not only teach you how to write a grant, but we actually review that and give you feedback if you're writing a brownfield grant specifically. We do no cost environmental site assessments. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the day, but that's just part and parcel to any type of property transfer. If you're looking at any type of property that you want to clean up and redevelop, you want to make sure you have a phase one prior to purchase. But I won't get too deep into the weeds there. I'll just put that out there because it's part of what I do and it's part of my DNA, just phase one prior to purchase. But we'll talk a little bit about that later. We have a Cleaner Commonwealth Fund in which we do sub-grants and loans for brownfield cleanup. We also provide technical assistance for contaminated or potentially contaminated sites. So if you have technical questions or technical issues, we have staff who can help you through those. Regulatory guidance, and then we also have a liability protection for prospective owners of brownfield sites. So if you're going to take one of these on, there's steps that you can follow to, you know, make sure that you know, you're protective of people who use it, but you also have some liability protections for yourself as well, because you're really not the person who caused the contamination. But you know, if you have any of these in your community, and you know, you might be asking what a brownfield is, so I point to any of these pictures. It could be an old rail yard, a former gas station, a former factory, an old school, abandoned hospital. Any of these might make your community a candidate for our program, but they're also wonderful redevelopment opportunities. So if you have former gas stations, dry and cleaning establishments, abandoned factories, meth labs count, scrap yards, landfills, brownfields aren't these great big factories. They're smaller establishments as well, and they're things that can really hold up redevelopment in your community, but can also pose dangers to folks. I will say that dry cleaners right here are one of our scariest type of establishments because dry cleaning fluids, once released in the environment, you know, can you know, vaporize and cause vapor intrusion in buildings. So, and it likes to travel. It travels quite well. So the things that you may not necessarily think of are some of the properties that we deal with in our program. So why are you sitting here with brownfields people in a grant writing workshop? So we have lots of grant experience. We've been helping with grant writing since 2006. It's a cornerstone of our program. We help communities apply for brownfield and other grants each year. And once again, we provide detailed feedback and guidance if you are writing a grant. It's a highly competitive process, so we want to make sure that we provide the support that you need to make sure that the document that you send to EPA is the strongest document possible. And we'll teach you about the basics of grant writing, but throughout this presentation, I will be teaching a little bit about brownfield grant writing at the same time. In fact, a lot of my examples are from brownfield grants because that's a lot of what my experience is. I've written quite a few grants and been awarded grants, but mostly in the environmental realm. So that's our grant experience. So this is why we're coming to you today to hopefully impart a little bit of grant writing knowledge to you. Some tie-ins and takeaways we hope that you have. We want you to be able to find the right grant from the right source. We'll talk about making sure that you analyze your fit for a grant. We want you to understand the major components of a grant proposal and be able to demonstrate community need and project goals when you're writing. You should be able to understand the importance of measurable outcomes. If you're not measuring your success, you'll have problems later on in terms of making the case for your programs. We want you to know how to establish credibility and show your capability. You should be able to recognize grant opportunities for community development. Be familiar with different types of brownfield grants by the end of this. So that's the bonus of today. Not only do you get the basic grant writing, but you'll come away with that brownfield grant knowledge and know how to incorporate certain themes within brownfield grants. So once again, I'll be teaching you basic grant writing, but also some brownfield stuff along the way. Some disclaimers, quid pro quo, provisos. We can't make you an expert in 2.5 to 3 hours, but we hope to increase your knowledge. Attendance can't guarantee a grant, but hopefully it'll get you closer. You can use every tip and trick in this presentation, but the end grants are subjective to the reviewer. So there's just going to be some frustration there. And every grant is different, so follow your guidelines. So just hold on to your seats. This is going to be a quick ride. I will say that when we get to do this in person, I actually do a grant review exercise. I can't do that. This is usually a much longer presentation. So hopefully in the coming months, we'll be able to get back out there and do these things on the ground, and we can do those exercises that sort of bring home all the concepts that we're sort of teaching in this class. So in the end, I want everybody to be realistic about grants and grant writing. It's not all rainbows and unicorns in the grant writing world. So you have to make sure, this is a lot of work, the researching, the submitting of the grant, and implementation. So make sure that you have that discussion with yourself and with your organization about whether you're ready to do all of this, because especially some federal grants have a lot of ins and outs and requirements. So you have to be ready as an organization to take on grants. It's really, really attractive to see that money out there, but if you're not ready, it will show, and it might impact your ability later on down the road when you are ready. It'll impact your ability to get grants. So you don't want a bad track record off the bat. So let's talk about where you can find grants. So first of all, there's government grants. These are the ones I'm most familiar with, and where I'll be providing most of my material from. Those are federal, state, and local. Those tend to be fairly formulaic. You also have foundation grants. Those are funds or endowments managed by trustees or directors. You have the Gates Foundation, and some of these large-scale corporations or benefactors have these large charitable foundations. The Ford Foundation, you name it, it's probably out there. It can be independent, company sponsored, and then you also have corporations. Corporations, a lot of times, if they're part of a problem, they will have a program to fix it. So think of spray paint companies might have a graffiti abatement grant. And I think, Exxon, when they had this spill in the Gulf, they had a lot of relief grants for people who, lived and earned their living off the Gulf. So that's where a lot of corporation grants might help solve a problem that they're connected to, or, a lot of them have good, just general corporate sponsorships for good community action too. So I don't want to say it's all problem oriented, but just know that those are out there as well. Just a little bit about foundation and corporate versus federal. Foundation and corporate grants are usually good startup and seed money. They tend to be less formal, and the reporting is not as structured. There tend to be fewer applicants than across the board for federal and state grants. They're usually flexible to unique circumstances. So, depending on what's going on, they might have a specialized grant, depending on, the board and what they see a focus is. So those priorities can change with foundation grants. Project periods are usually 1 to 3 years, and they're open to nonprofit wings of state government. I will say that the applications might actually be harder to write. They tend to have shorter applications, but you really have to be very succinct in terms of, what you put in those. So it's sometimes a little bit harder to write those. Or if you look at federal grant, they're set by legislation. There's a formal application process. It's very structured in its wants in terms of any type of proposal that you are asked to put together. There's structured reporting. There's a lot more applicants depending on the type of grant there is. You do have the potential to hire staff from federal grants, so there is a lot more upside on that particular vein. Very prescribed format on these. There's multiple year budgets. So I can tell you in brownfields, we have everything from a 1 year, budget to a 5 year. So they're open to state, local, and nonprofits, but they tend to be fairly predictable. So you can actually look at last year's guidance and have a pretty good idea of what they're going to ask for this year. So one term before we get too far into the weeds that I'll be using today is the term request for proposal. A request for proposal is an invitation that is extended by a funder to an organization to submit a grant application on a specific topic. So I will say RFP ad nauseum today. So just make sure that you're aware of that term. If you weren't before, a lot of you probably are, but just want to make sure that we cover that little bit of housekeeping before we go too far as well. So what can you do with a grant? Well, you can cover program expenses. You can cover salaries and benefits. You can buy equipment and supplies, cover travel expenses for staff, depending on, it could be anything from travel to do your project or travel to gain expertise. You can cover education and outreach expenses, indirect costs if you have an indirect cost agreement with a funding agency. So that actually helps you cover some of your overhead, and also administrative costs associated with your grant. So, and all these will be different depending on the grant that you apply for. So how can you write a successful grant? You're going to learn the basics, and that's what we're going to sort of talk about today. You're going to write tight. I will tell you that while there's some place for creativity in grant writing, a lot of times it's an exercise in precision. So you're going to make sure that you write to whatever that RFP asks for. You're going to try to be as unique as possible, whether that's in your program or your place or your situation. You're going to demonstrate that you need something. Your community needs something. You're going to demonstrate your worth in carrying out whatever you're proposing. And you're going to be patient and persistent, because sometimes grant writing doesn't go quite as we want it to, but that doggedness really pays off. It might take you more than one grant write cycle to be funded, but hang in there. So we're going to talk about the grant process. So when you're looking at the overall grant process, you're going to find and assess the fit. When you look at grants, you're going to look very, very hard at, what your agency can do, what your needs are, that funding, is it appropriate for what your needs are? If it is a fit, you're going to write that grant. You're going to spend a lot of time writing that grant, more than you probably think you will need. You're going to apply for that grant. You're going to wait for whatever seems like forever, and then you're going to win and lose. And if you do lose and it's a federal grant, make sure you ask for feedback. They will provide that for you. Some of them will provide the score, some of them won't, but they'll give you reviewer comments so that, you know, the next time that grant comes around, you can make adjustments and hopefully have a stronger document the next time. So finding grants, there's no real magic tricks, it's research. There are lots of free and fee-based websites out there that can help you identify grants. You can ask similar agencies to yourself how they get projects funded to identify, you know, some of the resources that might be available to you. And libraries and universities usually have subscriptions to sites or not manuals, but books that you can look at. But a lot of it is just Googling and looking out there and you know, determining what's out there. And a lot of it is you'll find a grant and it may not necessarily work for you. So it's a lot of legwork. So just some federal places to look. If you're looking at federal grants, there's grants.gov. The Foundation Center for Foundation Grants, the Grant Plant, Grant Watch, Chronicle Philanthropy, Kentucky Nonprofit Network, you know, Grant Watch. These are all places that typically have grants that you can look at, but there's also just Googling. So there's lots of ways out there and different avenues. Depends on if you wanted to do paid or just do the legwork yourself. You know, grants.gov is federal, you know, totally free. There is a lot on there, but you can actually sort and filter depending on what your need is. So that makes it a little bit easier because there's lots of research grants out there and very specific formulaic, you know, they're looking at, you know, the San Fernando Valley and this research project to do this. But you can sort of filter those out and do much broader searches as well. Things to consider when you're looking for a grant, what type of funding do you need? So how much funding is needed? Do you need something that will fund staff? Do you need something that will just fund some equipment? Do you have a high ticket? Is it low ticket? So these will help weed out some of those grant options. How does your organization need the funding? Is the project a priority for your organization? How much time do you have to devote to writing? And is your community on board with the project? So these are all things that you need to think about when you're looking at grant funding. So if when you're looking at funding and you're looking at a particular project, is it really important to you, or is this just a side item that you may or may not want to do? It may not be the it thing. If it's not in your focus, if it's not in something that you'd already be doing, may not be a great fit. Are you coming across this grant opportunity at the very end of the grant cycle, that open period for that RFP? If you only have 3 weeks to write a grant that has a 2-month timeline, there's a lot of, if you've written grants before, you know that there is a lot of research that has to go on to write it. So there's some exceptions to this. I will say that it's never not worth the time to write one in a short period of time. In fact, I have an example a little bit later that will prove me wrong on this, but sometimes it's better just to wait to the next year and come across that funding, put it on your calendar of when that funding typically comes out, and make sure that you have enough time to devote to writing. And is your community on board with the project? If this is something your community doesn't want or need, you may not get the support that you desire in writing this grant. So you're going to have partners and folks backing you. In most federal grants, they look for that. So if you can't demonstrate these things, it might be harder. Always ask, is this right for us? Is the purpose of the funding compatible with our mission? So, is this something, like I said, is this something that you'd be doing anyway? If it's just chasing funds because they're out there, you may want to think twice. Just because it's money, it can staff people. If it's not something that's along the lines of your mission, it's a stretch. Is this something similar or part of or already part of your long-term plan? Once again, if it's not already in your view of what you want to be doing, I would skip it. Is your organization eligible? Make sure that you're an you're eligible entity. You have to review that RFP to make sure that you're eligible for those funds, because sometimes it's very, very specific. Is that deadline realistic given resources and the time available? Once again, do you have that time to write that grant and the resources to match that grant if it calls for it? And can we produce a technically qualified, highly competitive proposal? Most grant proposals or RFPs, there's lots of competition out there. So you have to make sure that your document is really, really, like I said, tight in terms of that RFP. So if you can't produce that, if you don't have the research, if you don't have the legwork that's really, really, required, it might be best to wait till next year. Of course, I will put this caveat out there that sometimes it's just worth the exercise of writing it to get feedback. It may not be the best idea overall for some folks, but some people, submitting something, seeing what that feedback is, and then preparing for the next year that way as well. But you have to have the time to devote to that as well. Is the amount available compatible with our funding needs? If you need $5 million and it's a $5,000 grant, it's probably not worth your time if you can't bring something to fruition. You have to know how competitive the funding will be. So, will there be 20 people applying for this or 500 across the nation? So knowing what your competition pool is, unless you have a strong, compelling argument, strong need, you need to determine if the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of writing this. So if you don't necessarily have a high chance of getting this because you have an argument but it's not really compelling, then you may need to skip on to something else. Do you have the fiscal ability to provide reimbursement? So a lot of grants are reimbursement based. It's not they just deposit money into your account. So can you pay for things outright and wait for that reimbursement process, which may or may not take a while depending on how it's set up. And of course, are you prepared to live up to the terms of the grant award, from reporting, fiscal responsibility, evaluation requirements, and everything else that comes along with it? You've got to be ready to make sure that you live up to those requirements, because that establishes your track record for everything down the road. So if you can't perform to that level, wait until you can. So the big picture here is funders see grants as business proposals. So funders want to make sure that funders want to make sure they invest their money wisely. So you've got to put forth that compelling argument that you're a good solution to this problem and you're going to do the project and you're the right people to do it. So you're going to offer specific, realistic solutions with positive impacts in your applications. So some keys to success. Get to know potential funders. You may want to look to see what they've funded in the past. So look at their track record. A lot of them have examples of projects they've funded in the past. They have information sheets. Take a look at those. Take a look to see what organizations they funded. Are they similar to your own? So that will give you an idea of what your success rate might be. Make sure you do your homework. That will save you time and effort. For federal grants, look at current and archived webinars on their grants. So I know with brownfield grants, they usually do some sort of educational webinar that's archived on a site. So you can go back and listen to see what they're looking for. It might be last year's core objectives, but it can still tell you usually what they ask for in a grant and what their aims are with that money. And then look at the foundations, look at their websites. A lot of them do the same thing. And then also look, are you in your research, are you proposing something that they've already funded? So that might actually help you decide on whether you want to apply as well, because you don't necessarily want to duplicate a service. So just be aware that, you know, that falls into an issue too. So if you've got programs that have already been funded ad nauseum, you may not be as attractive, but that might just be a call to the foundation or the funding agency just to find out. But just be aware that that's something that you should, you know, check out. Other keys to success: partnering with organizations. It's a win-win-win, and we'll talk about partnerships a little bit later. But really, it shows that you're, you know, working with communities, working with other organizations to accomplish a goal. So, you know, you have a aim that's bigger than your own organization. It's not just about the money, it's about the project, it's about getting something done. Another key is writing a strong proposal that's clear, concise, and interesting. Once again, this may not be the greatest for storytellers out there, although in the introduction and some of your cover letters and things like that, you can definitely, you know, offer some storytelling in there. But in the end, it's making sure that you are, you know, hitting all the right notes in terms of the grant writing. Always allow yourself ample time, more if you're new to grant writing. So there's several things that you have to do. If you've never, or your organization has never written a grant, you have to, especially if it's a federal grant, there's several things that you have to do, like set up a grants.gov account. You might, you know, need to find out, spend a lot more time on research that first time around and gathering information. So make sure that you give yourself plenty of time. And know your project management style. Some grant elements don't really work well with last minute operators and that procrastination model. So if you are that way, I would say make sure that you ask for elements that are dependent on other people first, so that you get that done with. So if you need help with letters, if you need someone from your fiscal office to help you with a budget, make sure that you ask for those things first, because you don't want to ask for those things last minute. So always be aware of your style and how this grant writing project might work with other folks. And know your strengths and weaknesses as a writer. Like I said, you know, some people are technical writers, some people are more creative storytellers. So know what your strengths and weaknesses are going into this, and know what your strength. I will tell you, I'm a horrible budget person. I hate the budget part. So I always rely heavily on other people to help me with budget parts. So I know where I'm not good. So the most important key to securing funding is following directions. An RFP is nothing but a set of directions. So if you can't follow my directions, why should I trust you with actual money? So I will tell you, when you sit down to read a grant and it's out of order, or they have not answered questions, or they've not provided what you asked, you know, that taints a viewer. No matter how compelling your story is, some reviewers can't get past that. So make sure that you follow the directions. So let's talk about writing the grant proposal. So you have to understand what makes a winning proposal. And to do that, you have to study the RFP. I would say that, you know, I would read it once, you know, from stem to stern, you know, just for understanding, and then go back through and highlight those things that you need. You know, watch for typos, margins, autocorrect, and jargon, and keep a grant file of all relevant information that you may need in a grant. So there's things that you can do to make sure that you're hitting all of those marks. And like I said, you're going to have to write. We're going to talk about the review process, but you're going to have to write for different reviewers, and we'll talk about that. But all of these things sort of feed into that. Why are well-written grants important? Well, some grant proposals are rejected because they contain bad ideas, and those are probably few and far between. But most grant proposals are rejected because they contain good ideas that are poorly written. So the better that you can become at telling your story, at being concise, providing facts and figures, communicating that need and how your project will solve that need, the better off you'll be. So why do some proposals fail? They may not match a funder's priorities. I will tell you, every year in EPA, they have different priorities. Right now, they're climate change and environmental justice. So, those will be, elements in most every grant that EPA does right now. An organization might be out of service region. Once again, if you're not reading that RFP, you may not find out that they just want to, fund grants in Oregon rather than across the nation. Proposals do not follow the format. If you're not following that RFP and providing information in the right time at the right place, you are going to confuse your reviewer, and that will lower your score. No matter how, like I said, no matter how good your argument is or how good your project is, if you make it hard for the reviewer and hard to understand, you're going to score lower. The budget is not within the funding range. Don't ask for more than what they're actually willing to fund. So there should be a range in there. They may say that the grant, you can ask for up to this much, but a typical grant is actually within this range. So make sure that you look at that and talk to the funding agency. Your organization is not credible unless you, offer up to them reasons why you're a good risk in terms of funding, and that's your capability and your credibility. They may not see you as a good risk when it comes to their money. Once again, it's that business proposal. The problem isn't urgent. They see no impact with the program. So maybe you didn't communicate the need correctly or as urgently as you need to. The activities greatly exceed funding and timeline. So, is what you're proposing realistic in terms of funding and timeline? Is the budget you proposed realistic? Is your timeline realistic? To solve whatever problem that you're talking about in your needs section. Funds were allocated and you missed the cut. This is what happens to most people, or a lot of people. We'll talk about the scoring process and how federal grants are scored. And they fund down a slate, and if you're number 63 and they fund number 62, that's a hard place to be in, but a lot of folks are. And when it comes down to points, a lot of times there's not a lot of room for error when you're doing these things. The program will not be sustainable after completion. A lot of federal grants, and they just want to see that this will live on beyond that 1 to 3 year funding period, that this will have life beyond that. So how are you going to sustain this project, this program, after those federal funds have gone dry? So let's talk about that RFP again. So read the RFP, reread it, and then read it again. I can't tell you how important it is to make sure that you really take that in, really understand what they're asking for, and scour it from stem to stern so you know what your universe is. You can highlight and take notes. Everything that you need is in there, from the format, deadlines. They might have scoring rubrics in there that you can use to look at your grant objectively, or have someone else look at your grant objectively after you've written it. Contacts, checklists, etc. Follow the RFP guidelines. Up to 60% of unsuccessful grant applicants were either ineligible or they didn't follow the RFP. So that tells you exactly how important it is to follow that RFP. There is a prescribed page length and formatting element in most federal grants. Follow that to the letter. They're just not, messing around there. Extra pages can be discarded and not considered. If it is an 18-page limit for your grant and you provide 20, they can rip off those last 2 pages and not consider them. And you're saying, are they really that picky, Amanda? Well, yeah, they are. So here's 2 examples of grants that they asked for either double spaced and they single spaced it, or they got their margin size wrong. So those guidelines are in there for a reason. It's to make sure everybody has that fair playing field when writing their grant, because if you use a different size font and you can put in 2 more paragraphs, it changes what the reviewer gets to take in, right? So margins and fonts are big deals for a lot of grants. And I will say that the frustrating part is that's not, in some grants, they don't care as much. And some grants they care a great deal about. So I've seen it across the board. But in the end, I would just err on the side of caution and make sure you follow that. So some more basic grant writing. Make it easy to read. Reviewers have time constraints. So when you're looking at RFP and providing that information, make sure that you use short paragraphs and simple language. We don't want to jargon this up. And if you do use some jargon, make sure that you explain it. Create clear titles and subtitles that follow the guidance. That helps that reviewer read down your document and they can check guidance along with your document. So they're making those checks in their mind as they go. They've hit all of the questions. They've answered all of the questions. So that just helps them in making sure that you've answered everything. Don't overdo bold and underlining. Just use them when you need to. If specified, follow spacing, format, and fonts. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times it's very, very specific, and you'll have a reviewer there with a ruler to make sure you followed the format. And then you'll have some that don't care, and then you'll have some grants that don't have anything in there, which is really weird. So it depends on which RFP you're reading. So, but like I said, in that vein of caution, make sure that you follow whatever's in there. Don't try to cram too much on one page. If there's no formatting, I would say don't tax your reviewer in terms of how much that you put on a page, and don't make it 10-point font. That's a little bit too much. If there's no font specified, use 11-point or higher. Watch for the points allocated for each section to gauge space, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the scoring section. But if it's when you're spacing your document, when you're considering how much space to use, and space is a big issue because you want to make sure that you're hitting all this RFP stuff, but you don't want to spend one whole page on something that is really just say it's a 100-point grant and it's 2 points in the scoring. So sometimes it's easier to talk about those things, but in the end, they want to hear more about other things when they're scoring that grant. So make sure that when you're formatting this entire grant document, that you pay attention to the importance of that particular section when you're writing. Watch the autocorrect. Whether it's a text or word, autocorrect is out there, and sometimes it corrects to something you don't want to say, where nurturing professionals become neutered professionals, underserved populations become undeserved populations, targeted tutoring becomes targeted torturing, and in-depth counseling becomes in-depth counseling. So make sure that you're watching autocorrect, and when you have someone else review it, because you need to have other sets of eyes on this, make sure that you've said what you actually mean to say. Be careful with acronyms and jargon. Spell out acronyms at first and then switch to acronyms later. I would say that if you're having multiple people help you with writing this grant, make sure that when you get information back to them, they may have provided to you in narrative format, but make sure that when you get it back, you put it in your own voice, because you can really tell if you've sort of cobbled something together and it's written in different voices, because we all have different writing styles. So get help from a lot of people, but make sure that you translate it back to your own language when you're actually writing this. If you need more room when you're writing a grant, where possible, condense spacing. Use Arial narrow. If they don't say that you have to do normal Arial narrow, you can try different fonts. You can condense headings. So take out some of those superfluous words in a heading, and but that allows that reviewer to still continue to follow those RFP questions, but in a very condensed way. And also remove extra lines in charts. So something that comes to mind is your budget chart. If you're not asking for supplies, take that line out and just leave in there what you're actually asking for as an organization. So when you're making that ask, keep it real. In terms of scope and capability, keep it real. In terms of what you're able to do, in terms of what your project is going to do, you want to promise, but you don't want to promise too much. Also, don't be too desperate. Be careful with your plea. You don't want to sound too desperate in terms of, if you say, this will, if we don't get this funding, this will not be done. We can't do this without you. You want to sound capable. You need money, but not too desperate. So there's a fine line that you walk here, that they're going to look at your capability and it's like, well, it doesn't sound like they have any other resources at all. So what's the long-term end game here? So if you make yourself sound too desperate, you need to communicate your need, but not too needy. And I understand that's sort of a fine line to walk, but it's out there. Find a good editor. Is your mom busy? So if you could have your mom read your grant, if she can understand what you're saying, and to this day, my mom really never understood what I did in brownfields, but if I could take her a brownfield grant and she could read it, then, I knew I did my job. If she understood what I was asking, what I was, and same for any other grant you're writing, because your reviewer may not be a brownfield expert. I will tell you, in federal grants, sometimes they bring in people who just volunteer for grant writing. So they may not be a subject matter expert. So you need to write for a subject matter expert and just the layman as well. So your grant should be, understandable across the board. Make sure you write in third person for federal grants. Sometimes foundations, you can be a little bit more personal. Some other things to consider. Don't ask for things that are ineligible expenses. That is written somewhere in your RFP, what your eligible expenses are. And I've made this mistake. It was one of those last minute jobs, that's like, hey, Amanda, we're gonna apply for this, write it for us. And you read the RFP and you make a mistake in interpretation, and all of a sudden there's a huge part in your grant that you really can't fund, so you have to stop and rewrite it because you can't ask for that. So make sure that things that you ask for are actually eligible expenses. If you're using, if this is the second time you've applied for a grant and you're reusing letters of support, make sure they're updated, addresses and dates. I've done that one too, forgotten to update, the date and, contact information and whatnot. Provide simple citations for statistics. It doesn't have to be like your college level citations, but, census 2020, or what have you is fine, but make sure that you provide citations for whatever statistics you use. You need to let them know where it is so they know if it's a credible source. Make sure your sources are no more than 5 years old, except for, of course, census, which is every 10 years. You can use older sources if there's not necessarily a lot of new research or nothing new. Maybe it's a needs survey that your community does every 10 years. You know, just maybe speak to that a little bit. Address and answer each and every question. Your RFP will have, and federal grants are bad about this, in that they have 20 questions under one bullet in an RFP. You know, and addressing that can be a bear, making sure that you address each question. So a lot of times I will, you know, put that in a an Excel spreadsheet, and I will break out all of those grant questions, and that way I make sure that I have an answer for each and every one of them, because anytime that you don't answer a question, you are losing points. I've in the past turned a PDF into Word. There's different, I think Nitro, there's all sorts of PDF to Word converters on there. And that's where I pull it out and throw it in an Excel spreadsheet and combine it. And also get copies of successful proposals. A lot of times other organizations will share proposals with you, and you can get an idea of what's worked in the past and what hasn't. So, you know, what language works? What kind of evidence did they provide? How did they describe this part? Sometimes you get into some pretty technical stuff, and depending on what type of application you're putting together. So sometimes seeing how someone else has addressed it is worth its weight in gold. Okay, so let's see. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is you don't want to rely on your appendix to convey information. A lot of times you can provide attachments and things like that, but I would never refer someone to an appendix for, you know, reviewers don't necessarily have to look at an appendix. So if it's important enough that you want to include it, make sure it's in the body of your document. You know, because they may or may not look for that if it's confusing. So don't rely on that appendix. It's a great tool, but it should not be the cornerstone of your document. I will say that redundancy is acceptable in federal grants. They will ask you the same question 2 or 3 different ways, seemingly, but sometimes there's a reason for that. I will tell you that in brownfield grants, we have, you know, there's eligibility criteria, and then there's ranking criteria. And some of them have the same questions, or they used to have a lot of the same questions. And you had to really, you know, address them in both, because they look at those eligibility criteria first to make sure that you're eligible, you know, and then after that point, your grant is considered in a funding round where they look at those funding criteria and those funding questions. And if you have not answered them in those funding and ranking criteria and those funding and ranking questions, and you rely on that eligibility criteria up there, they're not required to go back and look at those eligibility questions. So if you don't express it in both places, you might lose points because you haven't provided the reviewer with the information in the place that they want it. So that's just an important part. It may seem really redundant, but that's just part and parcel of federal grants. A lot of it's not well written or well considered. I will tell you that there's a range of federal grant language out there. I have things that are buttoned up to the pin, and then I have stuff that's very, very nebulous. So there's, you know, just a range out there. FAQs, frequently asked questions, are incredible for finding out nuggets of information. Review those, because sometimes you'll find stuff that you didn't know was out there, stuff that can help you in writing. stuff that might determine whether you're eligible or ineligible, or things, that you might assume that aren't quite the case. So look at those FAQs, and a lot of times they provide you with great knowledge. We've actually used FAQs to make folks eligible before. We didn't think they were eligible, but we looked in the FAQs and look, there's an argument that can be made to make you an eligible entity. Use a checklist if it's available. There are oftentimes great checklists for grants where you can make sure that you have everything that you need in that application. So I will say that when you're addressing that RFP, if you can't address a criterion, fess up and let them know. They can tell if you're making things up, and they can tell if you don't necessarily have a strong answer. So, don't necessarily sell or tell something that you really can't. And don't write a story without statistics. This is very, very crucial because you're, going to be trying to convey your need, your abilities, and a variety of things. So statistics are very, very important to a grant. So if this is just a verbal exercise in which you can't put forth any type of statistics, it's going to be a lot harder to sell. Look for a scoring rubric within an RFP if it's included in the guidance. That can actually help you look at your entire document, and it can help you sort of, pre-score it to see if you're hitting all the high points that are needed. I will say that I have found information in a scoring rubric that was not in the guidance, and I don't know whether that was because they didn't update the rubric or update the guidance or what have you. But if there's discrepancies like that and they're out there, I would make sure that I would contact the funder and find out what they actually want. Like I said, some grant guidance is better developed than others. So make sure that you ask questions and ask early in a lot of times. Once an RFP goes out, their ability to help you might be limited. So if you're wanting to ask a funder about, different programmatic things, how this would sell to a reviewer, how is this looked at, you may need to ask that before an RFP goes out, because they get sort of embargoed in terms of what they can communicate to folks after a certain point. It becomes much more of an exercise. The only questions that they can say, answer are, how long does this have to be? What's the eligibility criteria? So it becomes a lot more defined in terms of what they can answer. Whereas outside of that RFP, that open proposal timeline, they can often in federal grant programs answer a lot more questions for you. Another thing that I, recommend to folks in basic grant writing is keeping a grant file. This is the information that you'll probably be using in a lot of different grants, over time. It can have your organization's history and credibility, information on your mission and objectives, staff bios. A lot of times, funders want to know who's working on their project, and you have to provide bios to folks, description of current projects and programs, special resources that you have access to, documentation of accomplishments and program accomplishments and your metrics, examples of community involvement, and copies of publications that might be produced by your organization. Nice things that people have said about you, your past grant performance. I usually have, when I was running grants fairly actively, I had a list of all of our grant numbers, the funding numbers, who gave it, what the timeline was, if it was complete, because we had to give a programmatic capability that we've done this before. So a lot of times that type of information is really, really handy. Statistics commonly used by your program, whether that's education stats, health indicators, employment data, and if not the stats, where you can easily nab them. So maybe the sources for those, where you can go back and pull the most up-to-date health indicators or the most up-to-date employment data. And, you know, make sure that you have easy access to that, because I can tell you when you find statistics and you think, I'll remember where I got that, you will never remember where you got that once you get too far into Google or too far into whatever research you're doing. So I would just make sure that you just have good notes when it comes to that. Another thing is needs assessment. You know, if you do a needs assessment, that's a really great thing to have in your grant file, and it's a really good basis for any type of community need or project need that you're trying to provide. And surveys pertaining to the client served. So if you've done, you know, client surveys and things like that, that's a good quality indicator that you may want to also have access to. Submitting your proposal. So, you know, those are some basic guidelines to, you know, writing and making sure that you hit all those high notes and, you know, stay within the lines and do what they ask. But you also have to watch submission requirements, paper versus electronic. You know, this used to be, when I started grant writing in 2006, you could do a paper application. You know, now everything's electronic. I still put paper in there because I don't know how foundations usually want theirs, but I can tell you federal grants, everything goes through grants.gov. You need to make sure you watch that deadline. You know, if you are doing paper still for whatever reason, is it a postmarked by date or this has to be in our office date? So make sure that you know, watch that. Like I said, I'm not sure if anybody does paper anymore. The good old days, right? Watch your font, your margins, all that good stuff. Make sure that you have your cover letter and required forms. Once again, identify that checklist if it's there, and make sure that, you know, you have whatever attachments are allowed in the appendix. Some other things I may ask for in the appendix, a lot of times if you're a nonprofit, they'll, you know, they may want you to submit a 501c3 letter along with your document. They may ask for a board of directors list, annual reports and audits, you know, letters of support and commitment, organizational charts. So there's a long list of things that they could ask for in an appendix. So make sure that, you know, when you're, you know, submitting this in grants.gov, I think there's a separate space in there where you put your appendices and things like that, but make sure that you're submitting what they ask for. If you are submitting in grants.gov for the first time, make sure you get started early. It can take 2 to 3 weeks to get an account set up. We've had folks who were going to apply for brownfield grants who did not make this deadline. And I have to say, you have to have a DUNS number and a tax ID as well. So make sure that you have all of this stuff taken care of beforehand. You also have to register at sam.gov. That's the system for award management. And when you're actually submitting, make sure that you maybe don't wait until the last day to submit. Grants.gov has bad days too. It crashes. It's just like every other database and tool out there. So some grants have instructions if a problem arises. Take screenshots if you need to, just to prove that you are having some sort of difficulty. But just I would not wait until the very last minute if at all possible. Just a note here that many federal grants are subject to e-clearinghouse. There's basically an intergovernmental review process required by Executive Order 12372. And Kentucky has a single point of contact, and that's within our Department for Local Government. So there's actually instructions on Department of Local Government's website on how to do that process. So after you've submitted the application, you're waiting. So be prepared for follow-up questions. There's sometimes granting agencies, a lot of them, if at all possible, they do not want to throw out your application. Some of them do because they have a blue million applications. But I know in brownfields, for instance, if they had a question on eligibility and moving you to the next round, they would either call us or you as an applicant to get a better understanding or to clear up things that might make you ineligible. So there may be follow-up questions that your funder comes back at you with. So be prepared for those. Understand scoring and final selection, and that should be part of the review process should be spelled out in your RFP. So you should be aware of how that scoring will take place, general timeline for final selection and what have you. And learn from your mistakes as you're, of course, going through this. You can, already make lists of things I should have done and things like that. So make sure that you're tracking how that process went. So let's talk about a little bit about the review process, because that is actually sort of, the magic in grant writing. Like I said, in your RFP, it should tell you what the review process is. Whether it'll be scored on a regional panel across the nation. Will states get, each state gets so much funding? How it will be selected? Is it a ranking process? And what those final, how they make those final funding decisions. So that should be somewhere in your RFP. It's a federal grant, or it should be in most federal RFPs. And, federal grants are really just a scoring exercise. So this is actually from brownfield grant competition. This is just a section that I pulled out, and it tells you exactly how many points each section has. So you'll remember earlier in the presentation, I told you to pay attention to your space according to what the points or the scoring is associated with it. So you're going to spend a lot more time on a 6-point section than you will a 3-point section. So that just nods to how important it is in your writing. So you could actually probably formulate, using Excel or using a calculator, determine, this is a 12-page grant. This is a 12-point section out of 100 points. So how much, you can do that math. I will never do it, but I'm math adverse, but you can absolutely come up with an approximation of how much time you should spend on each section if you really want to get that into the weeds. But anyway, so that will tell you exactly how many points you can win or lose in answering each of these questions. So you can sort of break that down and know that, if I don't answer this, I'm going to miss 3 points. That's going to, come off the top of my 100 points. So very important stuff. So let's talk about what the actual process is when, grant reviewers get grants. So first of all, the federal grant reviewers, it's usually a 3-person panel. They receive a stack of grants depending on how many they get. It could be a lot of grants, it could just be a few, but you're going to have a panel of 2 to 3 people who are reviewing each grant. So first of all, you're going to have to make it through to see if you've met threshold requirements for that grant. So first they'll determine whether you're an eligible entity and whether you can be scored. This is sort of pass fail. If you haven't met it, if you haven't satisfied something in the RFP, they can eliminate you. So after you've made it through that, you make it to your selection panel of 2 to 3 people. They independently score your grant. So they go to their own corners, they get their stack of grants, they assign these, scores. They come back together. They have to be within 10 points of one another in their scoring. And if they aren't, they have to go through each of those grants and make arguments of why they scored it so high or so low, and come to a consensus or come closer together. I'll move mine up, you move yours down, or or what have you. So they have to be within a 10-point consensus. Then those grants are assigned a score, and they're averaged, and that's how they develop a funding slate. So you're scored an overall, you're given an overall score on your grant, and then all of those scores are put on a funding slate from highest to lowest. And it's given to headquarters, Congress for approval. And this is where I say politics happens. And this is not so in all grants. There's no truism across the board for all grants, right? So I will say in brownfield grants, they don't want to see, letters from members of Congress, but I won't say that for all grants because some of them have a much more political bent to them. But letting your congressperson know that you're applying for this may move things in and out. But this is sort of where this political thing sort of happens, that when they're looking in that funding slate, things may move up and down. But once it's sent to headquarters or Congress for approval and they do their magic or no magic, whatever it is, it's sent back down to the funding agency and they fund down that slate until they run out of money. They might have the ability to partially fund things as well. We've been called in the past and say, hey, can you do this project for $20,000 instead of 25, so they can fund a little bit more somewhere else. So, but they'll fund down that slate until they reach a point where they've run out of money. And I will say that sometimes they'll put aside funds for special considerations, such as natural disasters, high unemployment, and stuff like that. If there's like a tie in between, certain grant applications. So, those are things that you want to, keep in mind. So sometimes those things also make a difference. So if you're not funded, like I said at the very beginning, request feedback. You won't get a score in some cases, but you'll get your comments back of things that they marked off for in your application. So it will help you provide a more technical document in the future. So, all right. So some other notes on scoring. You'll want to make sure you identify your information sources. They don't have to, once again, they don't have to be formal annotations unless specified. And make sure that your data sources are credible. Wikipedia is not a credible source, but sometimes you can find credible sources on Wikipedia. So if there's sources cited down below and where they find information, you can go to those primary sources and cite those, but just be careful about Wikipedia use. I will say in scoring, spelling errors don't necessarily count against you, but they don't do you any favors either. So watch those. And always write with your reviewer in mind. I will tell you, in brownfields for a long time, I worked with, we were sort of like yin and yang. He was very detail oriented. I was very big picture. He would always, I will never go to your budget and add up the numbers. I'm just assuming that you can do math, but he would do that. But I was more the big picture, have you really described this in the right way? So we were really a pretty good grant review team, and you have to think of your grant reviewers that way. So you have to write toward the big picture person, the micromanager who's might be reviewing your margin size, and also, the person who will, the budget cruncher. So you never know who is going to be, reading and reviewing this. So keep in mind, that there's a wide variety of folks. And like I said before as well, it could be a subject matter expert, or it could be someone who doesn't know anything about the program in general. So, it's a lot of things to think in mind, keep in mind when you're trying to write these things, that, you have to write to all these audiences, but that's why grant writing is a skill and a craft. Reviewers miss things. So if you feel you're not funded because a reviewer error, there might be an appeals process. So just keep that in mind as well. So if you get feedback and you're like, wait a minute, I, totally addressed that. Why can't, I don't understand why I didn't get funded. So it can go back up for consideration. You may not have the same reviewer year to year. So what one sees as a problem, another might not, and vice versa. So you might correct something based on reviewer feedback, and you'll get questioned on it the next year. And that's just part of the process. It's a very individual process in the whole grant world. Every reviewer brings their own perspectives and biases. Sometimes people are very, environmental world, where's the water impacts here? Where's the air impacts when you're doing a brownfield grants? And you're like, well, that wasn't. So unfortunately, they bring their baggage with them, and you have to deal with that. So like I said, right for the big picture person, the number cruncher, the technician, and treat them all like a guy off the street, like they don't know anything about your project, anything about jargon or anything like that. So win or lose, follow up your proposal with personal contact. Thank the funders. Don't get up if you're rejected, get feedback, try again. And you get that feedback, evaluate your proposal. What elements didn't work? Can they be fixed, or is it a deal breaker? If it's something that you cannot change about your program, then you probably need to look for different funding. So just be very, very critical of that, and don't waste your time. Continue relationship building, but don't be a pest. We've had certain people that had bad relationships develop because they were very pestery and very accusatory. So watch how you build those relationships. So that's just word of warning. Everything's supposed to be objective, but these are people too. So just make sure that relationship stays positive. You may not feel positive about everything that they do, but they do this for a reason. But just make sure that you watch those interactions. If you got a grant, nurture that relationship too. Comply with those reporting requirements. Send pictures of feel goods. A lot of times, I will tell you that the further up you go in government, the more detached you are from things. So local government's a lot more boots on the ground than state government, and than the federal. So they like to see the pictures of the feel goods. You may not be done with a project, but sending something to your project officer, showing them that some sort of benefit is happening on the ground, makes them feel good, and they share that with their staffs, and you gain credibility with a program right there. If you have good relationships and a good project, it might mean more money down the line. And building a good relationship makes you a known quantity. So those are just some words of wisdoms there. So at this time, I think we'll go to the question and answer pane, and let me pull this out. Or Lindsay, can you help me out there?
I can. So we have quite a few questions.
Okay.
Joni Beaver wants to know what kind of staff can be hired with a federal government grant.
So it depends on your project. So it can be anyone. It probably has to be project related. I wouldn't necessarily hire someone who's strictly fiscal and administrative, but someone who's going to carry out the actual project of your proposal. So someone who's going to do the nuts and bolts of what you're proposing. So it could be anything from for brownfields, it could be a consultant, it can be someone who goes out and does your phase one. I would imagine if you're doing like, some sort of community action grant, it's someone who provides a service. So I would say that it's not necessarily your administrative, although there's money for administrative staff and for, that overhead. When you're actually hiring staff, they have to be project specific to that. I hope that answers that question. So it's your actual boots on the ground person who's going to be doing the nuts and bolts of whatever you're proposing. So.
Wonderful. Then we have another question from Cassie Barnes. She asks, what states do you work for? Because I am out in Georgia, can I get help?
I am Kentucky specific. I'm not sure of our counterparts in Georgia. So unfortunately, I can't spend a lot of time helping you out. I can point you to some resources on our webpage. I wish I could clone myself because I really want to help everybody, but specifically we work with Kentucky and Kentucky communities. So.
Wonderful. We also have Cassie again asks, can I do a grant if I am a new company?
So you can, are you in, well, depending on if you're an eligible entity, first of all, have to check to make sure you're doing that. The barrier that you'll have is probably programmatic capability. And we'll talk a little bit about that today in terms of if you don't have a track record, how do you bolster that? So that becomes your biggest barrier when it comes to applying for these types of things is, showing that you are able to carry this out when you don't necessarily have that track record behind you. So, and that's where you lean on partnerships and maybe your board and maybe your past accomplishments of your folks. So you probably can, but you just have to be aware that you might have a few more barriers when it comes to describing your what your capabilities are.
Excellent. Let's see. Joni says, thank you, by the way.
Great.
Terry Thompson asks, do economically challenged areas like Southeast Kentucky get priority or preference in some grants?
So yeah, so there's, I will tell you, economically disadvantaged folks or areas, they count as EJ areas, environmental justice areas. A lot of times grants will focus on those types of areas. So yes, a lot of people think that brownfields are, urban. I'll give you this example. A lot of people think of brownfields as being very, very urban, that only, the Louisvilles of the world and the Lexingtons of the world will get funding. And yes, they get funding, but we have just as much luck describing the needs and the impacts for rural communities as we do with the others. And sometimes they're much more compelling arguments because just the barriers that are faced by some of our southeastern communities. So a lot of times you have a much more compelling story. In fact, I have some language in here from Letcher County that is really compelling. So you can actually score really well, and sometimes your disadvantage is an advantage when it comes to telling a story and gaining points in a grant competition.
Wonderful. What else? Let's see. We have Terry again asks, do you get more money for grants if it is applied to school-related projects like health education, etc.?
That I do not know. I can't speak to that very well, so I am not going to speak to that. I can inquire, but I'm just not sure of that. So I try not to offer answers where I am not a subject matter expert. So sorry.
All right, I think, and we've had several people ask, yes, you will be getting copies of the slides and a video of the presentation as well. Cassie Barnes wants to know, what are good types of partnership for a board?
So we'll talk a little bit about that. So a good board can, I think a good board, has people who are connected to whatever your mission in life is as an agency. So it has a variety of people from nonprofit, governmental, and business world. So we'll talk a little bit about boards and partnerships, and specifically partnerships, but your board sort of, encompasses that as well as, who also has your back in terms of your board. But a lot of it is, folks that are connected. So for instance, brownfields, are community redevelopment. So the people that you would have at the table for solving your problem are also a lot of the people that you'd want to have on your board or in your partnerships. So, for brownfields, you may want to have developers, you may want to have bankers, you want to have community organizations, you want to have local government officials, you want to have individuals within the community. So these people are all the things, all the folks that you would need to make your project go. So those are the types of people that you want to have connected on your board or through your partnerships. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Excellent. It looks like you have answered everything and quite well.
Well, except for the one. So darn it, I'll know.
But you admitted you didn't know.
That's right. All right. Thank you, Miss Lindsay. I appreciate that.
Of course.
And we are, let's see, at about an hour and a half in. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and we'll start talking about the typical grant components. How about that?
All right, everybody, that would put us back at about 10:06.
All right. See you guys at 10:06. We're going to start back up. Thank you for letting my voice have a small break here. I'm sure your ears could use a break as well. So now we're going to talk about typical grant components. So these are the things that you find in most all federal grants or in other grants as well. They're just called different things, right? So just depending on which funder it is, but they all sort of ask for the same thing no matter what. So you will usually have a cover letter and introduction area. Sometimes you have a little bit of both. You might have a need statement or a community needs section, program design or project description, programmatic capability, past performance and partnerships, project evaluation, and then budget. So these might be called different things in different places, but they're all sort of the same element, and they're asking and trying to get to the same points. So let's talk about cover letters and introduction statements and things like that. And depending on what your RFP says, it may ask for a different combination of these things. So we sort of lump them together because they have a lot of the same elements. So cover letters. A lot of times cover letters are almost like an afterthought for folks, but I tell you that you should probably spend some time with your cover letter because grants, when you write them, and this is the creative writing problem here, are often so broken down in terms of scoring criteria and information that you have to hit that the ultimate goal and that description and that overview can sort of be obscured. So it doesn't necessarily do a great job of bringing everything together in this beautiful picture. So your cover letter is your opportunity to provide a concise summary of a proposal. So it's also one of the few places you can present that big picture. So spend some time with your cover letter. A lot of times this is the last thing that you write and you're really, really tired, but it's really important that you spend a little bit of time with it. Because it's your grant's front porch, so it really, invites people in. So it might have a description of your project. Your RFP may ask you to talk about your eligibility, who's the contact for the grant. It will tell you usually what it's usually 1 to 2 pages unless otherwise specified. So it will tell you what's sort of in there. It might include who and what you do, what you intend to do with this project, why is it important, how do you intend to do the work, what's going to be accomplished, why your organization is a good fit, and what the cost will be. Like I said, it should probably be the last thing that you write. It will be the first thing that your reviewers read, and it may be the only thing that some reviewers read and uptake. When we were talking about scoring, a lot of federal reviewers get multiple grants. So if you were sitting there with a stack of 12 to 14 federal grants, or 20 pages each, you've got to give them a bone. You've got to give them something to entice them, something that's sort of memorable. So it really behooves you to spend a little bit of time to make sure that this is really something that sort of sets you apart. So make sure it's powerful and grabs your reviewers' attention, and make sure that reviewers want to read the rest of the grant. So like I said, it's that front porch. You need to make your front porch inviting, so they'll want to come in and, into the grant house and read the rest of it and find out why, what's going on here, how is this project going to help, and this is the reason I should fund this. So along with that, you might have to do an introduction or applicant description. It really is your first impression that you make for a reviewer. So make sure you make a good first impression. This establishes what your organization is about. It can show your abilities to carry out a grant. It's one of the few first things that a reviewer reads, and it can color the rest of the grant. So if you're working on a federal grant, you may do a small intro here, and work in some language of who you are here, and provide more detailed information and programmatic capability, which we'll sort of talk about later. But you're sort of introducing yourself along with your community need and things like that. So there's ways that you can sort of weave stuff into this introduction to sort of accomplish multiple goals at once. But so this is sort of important to establish who you are from the outset, and what you can do. Let's talk about building your agency's credibility into the intro. You can talk about how you came into being, what your organization goals and missions are, how long have you been in existence, what you've accomplished, and going back to the former question, if you're fairly new and you don't have a track record, you might want to mention accomplishments of board members, your executive director, and other key staff who've made things come to fruition that you can mention in this. So there's other ways you can get at programmatic capability without having a long track record. It's just knowing the track record of all the elements that make up you as an organization. So you can sort of speak to that and sort of bolster your abilities when it comes to showing that you can do certain things. So even if you're new, it's a big barrier, but it's not an impossible barrier to get over. You may want to describe how you've had success, especially if it's related to the funders' areas of success. So, or their areas of interest. So, what have you done that's been successful that you can sort of speak to that might pique their interest? You may want to talk about how your agency does things differently. Do you stand out in the crowd, and, in a service that provides, in a world of services that provide education to people? How are you different? Are you innovative in some way? Mention those types of things. Who has your back? You may want to mention financial and collaborative support from other organizations. And these are types of things that you can put into attachments and, those letters of endorsement and those letters of support. And, in terms of credibility, you can always use quantifiable data to sort of back things up. Have you received honors? Are there model projects that you can point to that also bolster your credibility? Are there leaders in your agency's field who could be quoted about the importance of the services that you provide? And like I said before, you have to have program evaluations. If you're not proving your track record, you better start now. Program evaluation, it's actually part of every federal grant. So, we'll talk about logic models and things like that a little bit later. So, but you need to have a system of performance measurement so you can speak to your success and how well you do things. So let's, when you're doing a little general introduction, and that's a lot to put in an introduction, but it can be done fairly simply. So let's look at this credibility statement. So the Center for Strategic Initiatives has served the Anytown community for many years and is dedicated to helping improve the livelihood of Anytown citizens. Our center provides employment resources and adult education, which is fine. It's all true. It's all factual. However, if you tweak it a bit, The Center for Strategic Initiatives, a nonprofit economic development agency, has served the Anytown community since 1945 and is dedicated to increasing employment opportunities, civic engagement, and education access. Since inception, the center has reached more than 2,000 clients, created 750 work opportunities, and provided over 400 adult education classes. Recently, Governor Tom Smith called the center a comprehensive resource that has brought about positive economic and social change in Anytown. So you can see how a little bit more space used, yes, but a few more well-placed statistics, a quote, and some background really makes you stand out a little bit more when you're looking at, describing yourself. So, just those types of things can make a difference in a grant. So make sure that you have access to some of these things if they're, available to you. Also in the introduction, you might be introducing your community or the folks that you're serving. So this is where you're painting a picture. Reviewers, because they're at a national level, or a regional level, may not be familiar with you, your state, your town, the area that you serve, your population. So you're going to paint a picture of the area or the folks that you're going to, help out, and you want to imprint on their minds. So this sort of helps you stand out. And if there's anything special or unique about your town, it's a way that you stand out amongst the 10, 15 applications they have sitting at their desk that they're having to look through. But if you can sort of paint a picture, it really helps out. So, this is actually pulled from a brownfield grant. So Letcher County is located in the heart of the hills in southeastern Kentucky. Three of the eastern United States major rivers, the Kentucky, the Cumberland, and the Big Sandy, have their headwaters in Letcher County. Even after Daniel Boone and other settlers made their way into the area in the 18th century, Letcher County remained largely isolated until the 20th century, when railroads reached into the hollows to extract the coal buried in the hills. Large corporations like U.S. Steel and Consolidated Coal quickly built mining camps along the rail line, and the first half of the 20th century brought tens of thousands of immigrants to work in the mines along with local farming families. This era is reflected in the film about country music singer Loretta Lynn, Coal Miner's Daughter, which was filmed in Letcher County in the late 70s. So with that particular statement, if you knew nothing about southeastern Kentucky, if you knew nothing about the mountains and coal, it paints an incredible picture. Railroads going into the hollows, lots of immigration, and if they've seen Coal Miner's Daughter, all of a sudden they have a pretty good idea of what life may look like in Letcher County. And I'll tell you, earlier in the day, I referenced that sometimes last minute grants don't work, that you really don't necessarily have a lot of time to do this. This is actually a brownfield grant. And this is a young man that wrote this with 3 weeks left. It's usually, you have 2 months. It's a 60-day RFP. He came to us 3 weeks prior, and we're like, well, maybe you should wait till next year. And he said, no, I want to do this. So he wrote this, and this was the second highest scoring grant in the nation that particular year. So when I say that maybe you should wait till next year, it's not always the case. So like I said, there's no black and white in grant writing. It's all a whole bunch of gray. So it depends on where you're at. But this is one of my favorite pieces of language from a brownfield grant to this day. And I've been doing this since 2006. So I always like to share this. So now that you've introduced yourself, you need to talk about your community need. Or whatever need that you're going to address with your grant. So it may not be, it may be a certain population, it may be, what have you, but you'll need to describe what that actual need is. So this is where your problem and need statement come in. This creates the case for your proposal and need for funding. Need statements should answer the following: what is the problem or need, and how do you know it's a problem? So you can't just simply say this is a problem and not back it up with some sort of statistics. This is the part from which the rest of your grant springs. The rest of the elements of your grant, whatever section it is, whether it's your budget, whether it is your, evaluation plan, your project plan, all relates back to this need statement. So if you're not addressing this, make sure that whatever you address here, you address elsewhere in your grant and vice versa. So it should all work back and forth. All goals, activities, process, evaluations will come from this. So you need to clearly demonstrate that you're addressing a need not being addressed by another organization in your community. So developing a need statement. So you need to, address, it depends on what your RFP is looking for. What's missing in your community? What are your problems? What aren't you doing well because of lack of funding? So there's also a need organizationally that you need to describe as well, right? So you're doing all this work, but we could do more if we had funding, or we could do this side project if we had funding. What is your program missing that this, can fix the need, and that, how will that funding help fix that need? Your need really needs to be clearly related to your vision and mission. It should be agency very specific. It should be supported by statistical evidence. So absolutely, this needs to contain emotion, but don't necessarily make it a total tearjerker. You need to have those, you need to have zingers, but you also need to have that convincing statistic out there too. And simple documentation will work unless it's a federal research grant, and that's a whole nother ball of wax. But you don't want this to be just a totally and wholly emotional plea. You've got to have those statistics to back it up. We know that there are so many people within this area. If you're looking at school children, there's so many school children on a free reduced lunch. We know that this is the number of families under the poverty line. So what makes what are the statistics that back up your need statement? How do you develop a strong one? Well, there might be a list of things they ask for in the RFP that, there's specific indicators that they want to look at, so they can look at things across the board. So check your RFP first, and then develop a plan to collect the data. Where are you going to find all of this, and where can I find all my stats? And begin collecting data from various sources. And then after you've pulled everything together, and you can write that statement based on your findings and based on what they ask for in the RFP, and make sure that you follow that format that they ask for. So some sources, of course, census is one of the big ones. In just about any grant, they might ask for some census data. State agencies that are related to whatever your nonprofit does, whether that's education, social service, labor, public health, parks, economic development. There's a lot of annual reports and special publications where they do, they might be doing their own needs assessments, or they might provide their own quality data, for instance, we track a lot of water quality information, air quality information, so are things that you could access within our databases. Local governments do a lot of the same things. So are there organizations that can help you speak to what that need is in your local area, whether that's police, school boards, planning commissions, social service departments, and what have you. Local community groups also do needs assessments. Municipal and county groups, Kentucky colleges and universities, local, state, or national foundations. So there's lots of things that you can cite. I know that the Chamber just did a whole piece on our labor market. So if you're looking at something to do education for potential job seekers, it might be great to go pull the the Kentucky Chamber's recent job market data. So, just try to find information that, from various sources that can help you communicate your need. So once again, look at state, regional, and national association focused on your need. And, you know, if you have your own needs assessments, those are great. There's federal statistics out there. USA.gov/statistics is a great place to go. And then the National Center for Educational Statistics. I usually put that there because I'm invariably, you know, these we talk brownfields in this, but we get a lot of folks from other areas that we have a lot of education and local groups. So I try to throw a little bit of everything in here. Census Bureau, Kids Count, Kentucky Health Facts. So there's some great websites out there for collecting data for any type of grant. This is actually sort of the most time-consuming part for me when I'm trying to find the right piece of data, and sometimes it doesn't seem like the right piece of data is out there, but it usually can get close. Make sure that your data is up to date and always double check those sources. Is your source reliable? Is it recognized? Does the data address the RFP? You know, like I said, they might have a list of things they want very, very specifically. And that does the data support the need that you are presenting? So if it's just superfluous, if it's just a fun fact or something, you know, that's not necessarily down the line of what they asked for or what your need is, you should leave it out, because that's something that's real estate that you can use towards something else in your grant. Data should be clear and convincing. National, state, and neighboring community numbers are great for comparison, but you should not be using them exclusively to state your need. So local data is the strongest and most persuasive. So please be aware that, you know, the more on the ground in your area that you can get it, the more persuasive that it is. Like I said before, watch Wikipedia. You can use it, but only if you can find that, you know, original primary source. Make sure your need statement is easy to read. Use simple sentences and short paragraphs. Utilize commonly used words. Once again, avoid that technical jargon that we tend to use. Use strong words to communicate needs and problems, but don't over-exaggerate, and don't overwhelm or present a nightmare scenario if not funded. Funders do not like to be threatened. And I will give you an example. We had a person send me an email about brownfield funding, and they said the success of so-and-so community lays on your shoulders. And no one likes to feel that way. That's not really a true statement anyway. It really shouldn't weigh on anyone's shoulders, but it feels threatening in a weird sort of way. So, you know, don't overwhelm a reviewer and say, you know, unless we get this, you know, our town is doomed type of thing. So watch those statements. So you want to be, you know, very hopeful, and, you know, not make them feel like the weight of the world lies on their shoulders. Don't argue that you need funding without showing the need for it. Funders are concerned with the community, not your organization. Your statement must focus on who you serve, not your organization. Now, you're going to talk a little bit about your organizational need, but it should not be the primary need. If grant money is for the continuation or expansion of a program, make sure you provide data and outcomes of program benefits already realized. So we're doing a great job over here. If we had supplemental funding, we could expand these services and, you know, take care of this over here. So, you know, it's you know, all about making that argument. Don't criticize other organizations to make yourself look good. It's just, it doesn't make you look good. And use charts and graphs to simplify your data. A lot of time there's a lot of data that you want to communicate. So in those instances, I would say that, you know, it's good to use charts. So this is this is data that's typically asked for in a brownfields grant, in which we look at community corridors, and you're looking at, you know, indicators, social indicators. So unemployment, poverty level, population. And you can see within this grant, they've got their corridor that they're focusing on. They've got West Louisville in general, Louisville metro service area, Kentucky, and then US. So they're actually doing, and this is this is where, you know, that you can show how compelling that data is once you start looking at this particular corridor versus the rest of the US there. So it makes a compelling argument with your data alone. But that's where they've drilled down. They've used other data, but just for comparison's sake. And this is actually for a state grant. So ours looks a lot different because because we serve the entire state. This is one that we applied for. We talked about specific areas in Appalachia and in Rubber Town when we did this grant. Those are areas we would target because of low income and for, you know, barriers of various kinds. But we only have national to compare to. So that's just how we handled it. It's a little bit different from the previous slide. All right, so you've described your need. You've described your community and who you are. So now we're going to go on and talk about our program design and project description. So what are you going to do? What are your actions that you're going to take to address that need? Once again, everything's going to spring from your community need statement. So this includes all the specific steps and procedures for carrying out the activities of your proposed project. Like I said, all of your activities should relate back to that problem and need statement. So what's the element of your project description or your program design? So you're going to talk about who you're going to serve. You're going to give them an overall work plan, not necessarily specific because you only got so many pages, but you know, eventually that would come into play if you're funded. You're going to talk about advertising and recruiting plans. You're going to talk about information dissemination. How are you going to determine eligibility of services? You know, when someone comes to your door, who is eligible for those services? How are you going to monitor activities? And what's the timeline for all of this? So these are all elements of, you know, the program design. So let's talk about who's your target. Once again, who's being served by your project? So you may be asked to describe potential participants. Where, you know, is there a geographical boundary? You know, you saw that corridor application there. It was a Park Hill corridor in Louisville. You know, may be speaking to a specific community in Eastern or Western Kentucky. So, you know, a very, very simple one is our program is geared toward Anytown middle school students that receive free or reduced lunch. That tells you who you're targeting with your particular services. So after you talk about who you're targeting, what are the services that will be provided? When will they be available? Who will be performing those functions? Are you hiring new staff? We were asked about who can you hire with federal grant dollars? Well, you know, maybe you hired someone to do that specific function. And what are your performance targets? So those are all types of things that you'll describe in a work plan. So you need to think about those things as you're writing. And I will say, in general, this is actually the benefit of grant writing, is it really puts everything, whether you win or lose, there's a benefit to thinking through all of these things for your organization and your project, because I'm assuming this is something you want to do long term. So, you know, getting all these things out of your head, down on paper, whether you win or lose this time, it's really a valuable process. So never think of a failed grant as a totally wasted experience. How do you advertise, recruit, and disseminate information? So how do you get you know, you've talked about who you're going to serve, how you're going to do it, but how do you get them to look at your service? How do you get them to the door? How do you get them to take part? So how are you going to attract them to whatever service that you're doing? And once you get them there, how do you keep them engaged in that process? And how do you keep them engaged with your programs? So you may have to develop an outreach plan. Is your outreach, and one of the important things is to make sure that your outreach method is suitable for the target population. Obviously, you know, if you're looking at demographics, if you have, you know, if you're looking at low income folks in a particular area and they have a high level, high number of maybe Hispanics or something like that, you may want to make sure that your outreach has, Spanish language options, whether that's a YouTube video or whether that's, flyers or what have you. Make sure that you're using whatever language, whatever method is, good for your community. If you're targeting older population, Facebook may not be the best thing, or Twitter. It may be better to run an ad in the paper. But if you're looking for people who are 18 and under, Facebook may not be the right avenue anymore. I think it's people my age that proliferates Facebook, but Twitter and other things might be better as well. So you can use social media, newspapers, websites, radios, PSAs, direct mail, YouTube channels, public meetings, flyers. Just who do you need to contact and where are they at? You can go to other organizations' meetings, farmers markets. What's your population, where are they at, and how they get their information, and just making sure that your advertising, fits the bill. So once you get them there, you're going to have to sort of, who's eligible for this? What are your decision-making guidelines? What are your priorities? So think about that decision-making matrix when you're looking at services. So how do you, make sure that you are targeting the right people and getting the right people in your door? So take the time to create a thorough intake or decision-making process. So, in terms of brownfields, when we're talking about property redevelopment, we think about, what properties do we want to address first? Do we want to do ones with high, visibility, in the middle of town, downtown, ones that are easier to clean up, ones that are in, next to rail. So what are those decision-making criteria when you're trying to rank, when you only have a specified amount of money to do the most impact? How do you decide what your service targets are so you make sure that your money is used in the best way possible? So after you get everybody in, after you get them into your program, how are you going to track progress? So you're going to do some quality control. So are your services being delivered as promised? Are they provided at an acceptable standard? Are you following the budget? Are you tracking expenditures? So you need to monitor those things as you go on in your processes. And we'll talk more about evaluation here as well. Also, timelines. When will this take place? Give the funders an idea of what will happen when. This sort of solidifies the process in your mind. It helps organize your troops. If you do get funded, this timeline, helps provide how is this going to progress and when? So things that you could include into timeline, you can talk about staff hiring and training, market and client research, education and materials development, client assessments, data collection for baseline, service delivery, reporting of progress, and then closeout of grants. So these are all types of things that you will, address in a timeline. And how you show that is up to you. I've seen timelines simply as bar charts, and you can see, there's different activities in this job training, scenario that I've got here, where you're offering job training at different times, developing modules at different times, responsible parenting classes, so it shows the reviewer exactly when you're thinking of doing things. So you can do this with, bars with X's in those months, or you can do lists like this. In fact, this is actually something that we sort of do this in our grant reporting. We carry our timelines, historically in some of our grants, where we provide this timeline, and then, as the status changes, we report out on it. So it sort of carries through. But, so this is just different ways you can express a timeline, but they usually ask, what's going to happen when, in this whole project description that you're putting forth. So, All right, we're going into programmatic capability and past performance and partnerships. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
We do. We have one new question, and it is from Cassie Barnes. She asks, how can a company look good as a new company on a credibility statement? What should the main points be?
So once again, I would make sure that you have a clear mission and vision and goal selected there. And, I'm not sure the background of your folks, but we talked a little bit about falling back on, who's all the parts of your organization and what their experiences are, if you can do that. So that's going to be the strongest way that you can do that is once again, look at your individual elements and what their experiences are. Even if you as an organization, as the collective, haven't done anything new, your individual partners or individual parts of your organization may have accomplished those types of things. So that's sort of where you can go with that. I hope that helps a little bit. It's a little bit harder of a barrier to establish. I will tell you that, in brownfield grants, one of the hardest parts for nonprofits is, establishing that programmatic capability if they haven't had a federal grant, if they haven't been in existence for a while. So if you can speak to those things, that helps quite a bit. It also helps if you can do smaller projects first. Maybe you can get smaller pots of funding just to show a little bit of a track record. But those are the things I can offer up. If I knew a little bit more specific about specific examples, of who you are and all that good stuff, it might help. But generally, it's looking collectively at what the people in your organization bring to the table in that particular instance. So I hope that helps.
And I think that that's all we have from this part of the presentation. So go on whenever you're ready.
Well, actually, and this might actually help Cassie as well, is partnerships. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So that's a point that I sort of forgot to bring up. So, when we talk about programmatic capability, who proposes to do a project is just as important as what is being proposed. Funders need to be convinced that your organization is capable and has the necessary resources and support. So we'll probably speak to some of the things that I just went over here in this section. So this is really part of the, this is actually from a brownfield grant in terms of programmatic capability. So this is the evaluation criteria. So you can sort of look at what they've asked in terms of this federal grant, in terms of, programmatic capability and past performance. They're asking about, have you successfully managed a grant? Federal, have you, not successfully managed a grant? So they base scores on this. So this is where if you don't have that experience, you're going to lose points. So you have to make sure that you're buttoned up in other areas if you can't specifically speak to that. And that's what I'll also say, that if you're going to lose points in programmatic capability, just make sure you can speak to what you can speak to, but make sure the rest of your grant is really, really buttoned up so you don't lose points elsewhere. Programmatic capability you can talk about qualified staff, their experience, past and present. You can talk about having capacity, which is sufficient staff to do a job. Do you have physical facilities in order to accommodate the project? Do you have the physical and financial stability to accomplish the project? Are you client friendly? Are the people that you serve, are you set up to serve them in a good way? And your willingness to partner with other organizations. And that's where I will say that if you don't have programmatic capability, sometimes partnerships with other organizations can help make up for that. So programmatic capability is a section of many, if not all, federal grants. You may need to list key personnel here. Remember I talked about having a grant folder where you have bios? This may be where that comes into play. So you may provide a list of grants that you've managed in the past, and they may ask you about adverse audit findings and things like that. I will say that this is something that people lost points on. There's one little lowly question in the brownfield grants that says, have you had any adverse audit findings? And people would skip that question for some reason. And it was a point, but a point could mean the difference between being funded and not funded. So if they ask if you have no adverse audit findings, make sure you answer that. I'm not even sure if that's on there anymore. It's been a couple years since I've read brownfield grant guidance, but you know, so they may ask questions like that. Have you developed best practices that make your program successful? This is where you may want to mention it if it allows it. Sometimes it's very specific what they ask in programmatic capability, but you know, if you have a little bit more room. Foundation funders may ask more detail than government funders, and they may ask different things than government funders. So do you have highly qualified volunteers? Here's another thing, you know, when you're dealing with programmatic capability, do you have volunteers that might help out to make your program more capable or cost efficient? And you know, can you speak to that? And like I said, if you're nervous about programmatic capability, find yourself a few partnerships. You know, so if you can partner with an organization that does have a track record, it creates a larger pool of resources. You know, it does a few things here. First of all, there's a larger pool of resources from which to draw. So not only are you drawing from your resources and your partner's resources to accomplish a goal, but you know, you also have a chance to play off other skill sets. You know, particularly if you are, you know, say you do a lot of outreach and education, but you don't necessarily do a lot of direct service. If you can partner with an organization that does a lot of direct service, you know, it creates that complete package, right? So sometimes having those partnerships makes you much more attractive together than you would independently. It's a safer investment of funds if there's less risk for failure. So that partnership can, you know, also bolster in the, you know, reviewer's mind that, you know, that they're, you know, this is a good investment. It avoids duplication of services because you have two organizations that are working on the same problem, but not competing for funding. You're, you know, coalescing all of that funding and working toward that, you know, that problem. Evidence of being focused on what is best for the community and not just your organization, and your willingness to work as a team, especially with federal grants. They like to see a lot of partnerships. It can also help generate greater program support and community participation. So, you know, this just helps them, you know, helps you broaden your horizons as well. So if you can get a relationship with the partner, the people your partner organization serves, it can, you know, help you out as well in long term. Is a partnership a good fit? You need to ask. Does the partner have similar mission and vision? Are they already touching the same target populations that you do? What are the organization's motivations? Can this partner bring resources to the table? Often partners, if you do not have match for federal grants, we'll talk about match when we get into the budget. If you don't have match, sometimes your partners can serve for that match. So they can help you out there. Can you work well together? That's a biggie because you are sharing federal funds and you need to have a clear description of how you're going to work together and have clear expectations of the roles each one will serve. So just make sure that you have a good relationship. You're not, you know, you need to have something that's well thought out here. When you are considering partnerships, and this is not something that necessarily is in the grant, but I highly recommend this as you're working through your project plans and all that, is to make sure you have a project planning worksheet, like who governs what in this partnership, who governs the program activity, who makes budget decisions, who makes programmatic decisions. There's lots of them on Google. Just Google project planning or partnership planning worksheet. that fits the elements that you need, but make sure that you're doing this because, in brownfield grants, you can work together as multiple communities, but you need to have an understanding of how all that funding is going to flow. How's it going to be divided? Who makes the decisions? What that council looks like? What does your partnership look like? So make sure that if you're working with other people, that you have a very specific plan of how those elements are all going to work together. So who's great potential partners? It depends on who you are and what you're doing, but community colleges, universities, community-based organizations. I say, the more boots on the ground, the better, honestly. Career tech ed, social service agencies, chambers of commerce, mayors, city officials. So some grants are very specific on who can be a community partner too. So in some grants, your mayors and city officials are not community partners. They're looking more at community-based organizations and services. So, and community members and specific organizations. So have an understanding of what they consider a partner agency. Excuse me. In your application, you'll want to also describe your partners. So you're going to name each partner and organization, explain who they are, describe your partner's roles and responsibilities. And if it's needed, you should probably include a letter of support or commitment somewhere in the appendix. And we'll talk about letters of support versus letter of commitment here in a minute. But so you need to describe to them who's coming to the table with you. Letters of support versus letters of commitment. This has gotten a lot more specific, and it's very grant dependent on what they want. So a lot of folks just need letters of support. This is a great idea. We support it as an agency that deals with the same thing. We think this is a great idea. It's what this community needs. But letters of commitment are very different. And when you're dealing with partnerships, this is probably what your funder may be asking for. So this is very specific in that, you'll describe who, your funding, your partner will provide a letter of who they are, their pledge support, how much time, resources, or staff are they to commit to this project. They might provide a detail of the services and resources and an estimated dollar amount if they're going to help you provide, meet a grant match requirement. They'll have to give a little bit of background, just like you had to talk about who you were. They're going to describe who they are as well, and identify who the people they work with, so that community that they reach. So those are all types of things in support letters and letters of commitment. But that letter of commitment is a much stronger document. It's a much better idea of what is being committed to this project. So it's what a lot of funders look for. So just make sure that if you are getting partners, that this letter is more bent toward a letter of commitment with those specific resources that are going to be pulled to the table. Letter etiquette. So remember when I said that, some elements of grant writing do not work well with last minute operators? Letters are one of those things. This, along with budget and a couple other things, are the things that I work on first when I'm writing a grant, because these are the things that invariably, no matter what, you're still probably tracking them down last minute, but it's one of those things you need to make the ask first. So if you're looking for letters of support or letter of commitment, it's one of your first tasks that you should be doing. Give potential partners plenty of time to write a letter, 2 to 3 weeks. I try to get hard copies and electronic copies of letters, although I'm not sure how applicable that is anymore. Electronic probably is fine in this day and age. Make sure that the letter is signed by the highest ranking person in that organization, and the person is aware of that project. In some grant cases, they might make calls to partner organizations. That's been done in the past. Once again, I'm not sure where we are on that either, but I know our brownfield folks used to call partner organizations to make sure they called your bluff on your partners. So just be aware that, if you put a name on a letter, whether that's your cover letter, internal contact or an external contact, that they know what's going on, that you're applying for this grant and what it is. If you're requesting a letter, you need to provide those folks with, the name of the grant you're applying for, name and physical address, the summary of your project, maybe copy the abstract, and mailing instructions. The deadline, you can provide a sample letter, but watch out, you're probably gonna get that sample letter right back, or you can just write it for them, which is what I usually do. I provide them a very specific letter with everything that I need to outline or have included in that. I say, here's a draft, please feel free to change it, because it's a nicety, you're saving them time, but you need to offer, them, the ability to change it, and, this is the deadline. But yeah, that's the best way to get back letters of support. And if you've written a grant, you know that already. If you're writing a letter of support or commitment, of course, commitment would be different anyway, but make sure that they're a little bit different. I get form letters sometimes, and they're just really not impressive. So, I think it's a stronger element if it actually sounds like, they're meaningfully engaged and not just signing off on something. Make sure that scope is correct if it's a letter of commitment, that you don't promise too little or too much. Allow enough time for partners to edit and make additions to letters. And if you're recycling letters, make sure you change those dates and names. Been there, done that, made that mistake, but caught it just in time. My boss caught it, so we got it fixed. So, but just those things you learn over time. Once again, make sure you prepare the partners for follow-up calls, and and if they have further, the funder has any type of questions, they may follow up. And at the end, make sure you give your supporters a copy of the grant or a summary of the proposal after it's submitted, so that they know what's going on there. So, all right. So before I get to program evaluation, Lindsay, are there any questions?
We do have a question. This is from Cassie Bartons again. And she says, does your company website have support letters or commitment samples?
Sample ones? Or?
Yes.
We used to. I'm not sure that we have any up there now. It's been a while. You may be able to Google grant support letters. I know we used to have brownfield grant support letters, but I'll have to check. I'm not sure how our grant website has evolved over time, so I apologize for that.
All right, let's double check, but I think that is, yep, that is okay. Everything that you have right now.
All right.
I apologize. We had a little bit of glitch in the stream a while back, if anybody else saw that or if it was just on my end, but you came back just fine.
Oh, it's a glitchy type of day then. Sorry about that, folks. Glitches happen. All right, so let's talk a little bit about program evaluation. This is one of those things that nobody really loves to do, but it's so very, very part and parcel to any type of programmatic success. So there's no point in doing what we're doing if we're not evaluating it in some way. Looking at ourselves critically, looking at our services critically, and making sure that they're doing what we're promising to do. So if you're not doing program evaluation, you're doing yourself a disservice, because there's no way that you can really make great arguments in the future if you're not paying attention to now and paying attention to what you're doing and how you're doing it and the effectiveness of all of those activities. So, why measure performance? So I'll tell you, within the government, It's the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993, the GPRA. Federal funders require it. So it will be in every federal RFP that you see. So you'll have to tell them exactly how you're going to measure your performance when you're undertaking a project. And basically, GPRA was done to make sure that you achieve performance goals. It helps you identify efficiencies, identify areas of improvement, and improve service delivery. So there's a method to the madness. And I will tell you, I took, I got a master's in public administration, and I took 2 full semesters on performance measurement. So there's actually quite a bit to it. It's like I said, nobody really loves to do it, but it's a fantastic thing to do. And it's great when you can. There is such a fantastic feeling when someone asks you a question and you have these metrics and say, yes, we are doing what we're supposed to be doing. Here's the proof is in the pudding. So it's a great thing to have in your back pocket should someone question you or question the effectiveness of what you do on a daily basis. So what's in a measurement plan? So there's sort of 4 steps here. So you're going to create performance measurements. So what do you need to measure? What are your outputs and outcomes? Once you identify those, ID your sources of information and a collection process for each of those measures. You'll analyze your data and reporting results. And use those results to make improvements. So those are really sort of the 4 overarching steps to performance measurement. And if you do this right, and this gets tweaked along the way, but if you do it right, it can be a really great tool for you. So there's 2 types of measurements. There's outputs and outcomes. So think of outputs as that direct product. So it could be, materials developed, training classes provided, community watch programs established, traffic safety campaigns launched, the number of patients treated using new safety protocols. So it's more of just a widget, right? But your outcomes are much more results. They're results of your work. So, events, occurrences, and changes that occur as a result of your work. So, increased test scores from those training classes, reduced crime from your community watch programs, reduced traffic accidents from those traffic safety campaigns, and decreased secondary infections in a hospital because of those new safety protocols. So, the number of patients treated and discharged from a state mental hospital, which is an output indicator, is not the same as the percentage of discharged patients who are capable of living independently, which is an outcome indicator. So just think of it, those outputs are your immediate widgets, but your outcomes are really what you're out there for. So you may not be able to achieve all of your outcomes during the project period, but when you're writing a grant and they're asking you for your outcomes, you're going to talk about those long-term outcomes, but you're going to talk mainly about maybe outputs and some intermediate outcomes that you might see within a project period. Now, sometimes you can reach your long-term outcomes, but when you got 1 to 3 years, that may not be a long enough time horizon. So you're going to have to judge what you can measure during your performance period. So let's talk about some intermediate outcomes. Intermediate outcomes are expected to lead to the end results desired, but not necessarily the end results themselves. So people completing a voluntary work training program and show an increase in knowledge might lead to long-term income, increased employment. The number of people who started an exercise program, followed it, and showed initial weight loss might show improved overall health years down the road. So those are types of things that, if you can do a quality control or show increased knowledge or a decrease in some sort of adverse effect during whatever you're proposing, whatever problem you're talking about that you're trying to fix here, If you can show that intermediate outcome and measure it within your grant timeline, those are great things to have in your your evaluation, your performance measurement section. Good performance measures are matched well with your community needs and program objectives. Once again, everything matches back to that community needs section. If possible, quantifiable, use specific numbers and percentages. They're timely, they're within your work plan and length of grant, so make sure to identify what you can do within that grant period. But be realistic given the scope of your program. So, don't overly, promise and, think that you can get to point Z when maybe you can only get from point A to point D. So, just be realistic of where your program can get within your project period. Data collection methods. So, in terms of quantitative and objective, pre and post tests, service records, interviews, activity logs, case reports, performance reports, and then qualitative, those testimonials, anecdotes, success stories, and observations. So there's different data collections and different data types that you can collect and put within your performance measurement. But basically, this can take on a wide variety. Within brownfields, we might, brownfields redevelopment may take 4 or 5 years. So it's not going to fit within a 1 to 3 year grant, time span. So, we might talk about the number of sites assessed, the number of people we interacted with, redevelopment plans created, dollars leveraged and things like that. So there's different things that you can do to measure success and to, put metrics to an issue. And, when you're providing direct services, finding ways to measure those. So just take your time in developing performance measurement. It's really helpful. Like I said, it can really help you identify gaps and where you need to do better as a program, and make adjustments along the way. So if you do it well, it's a worthwhile activity and not just something that you're doing to check off a box. So I highly recommend spending some time with it. So let's talk a little bit about budget. My least favorite subject matter, but one that we have to talk about. I have never been and never will be a budget cruncher, and I admire those who are, and I appreciate them to the nth degree. But just not my cup of tea. But the budget section will spell out your project costs, and it typically has a narrative and some sort of spreadsheet chart of all of your expenses. So you're putting all the stuff, your resources, your in-kind resources, your grant money, you're putting it all together to make your project work. And this is sort of where you'll describe that. So whether it's in-kind, your resources, your partner's resources, this grant money, how's it all going to work to bring your project to fruition and to, make those results happen that you're talking about to help address that need that you've described in your grant. So once again, you're probably going to have a chart of expenses, details of match and cost share if it's required. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but a lot of federal grants have some sort of match that you have to meet. And then details of the budget categories in narrative form. So, where's this money going? How you spend it? How did you come up with your costs? So these are all the types of things that you'll have to sort of, talk about in your budget section. Typical things that you'll see, personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, all those types of things are in a federal grant budget, and they will usually tell you what's, what your limits are, what you can charge, to your grant and those types of things. So pay attention to that budget category. Don't ask for those ineligible expenses. They're very, very specific with that. They're also very specific about administrative versus non-administrative costs. So a lot of grants will say that you cannot charge administrative costs. And administrative is basically, I try to think of it as the all the paper pushing that goes on with a grant. So it's your fiscal management, it's your reporting, those types of things. But a lot of times they'll cover all types of programmatic costs or non-administrative. So anytime that you're hiring people to do direct services, salaries and indirect costs associated with performing a function, supplies, equipment, and travel related to performing that service. So if it's a direct service, you can usually charge that as programmatic costs. So just be aware that that's something that you need to pay attention to. Brownfields, you used to not be able to do any type of programmatic or administrative costs, but now they actually have, I forget what the percentage is now, but they have that built in, so you can get administrative, but that will change from grant to grant. But think of administrative as the paper pushing versus providing that direct service that's going to take care of that community need that you've described. So when you're developing a budget, you need to, of course, identify and study the budget instructions and the guidelines. Read them and form a checklist of information to gather. So if you're doing salaries, you're going to have to figure out, what the salaries, individual salaries of the people who are going to be carrying out this grant. So you might have to ask your fiscal people, what's the baseline salary for this person, and this person, so you can do hourly and make those budget costs align. Any type of supply costs, so you're gonna have to do a little bit of background information here. Determine what you need to carry out the project in terms of participants, staff hours. You have to do some prognostic. I mean, this is all, just sort of magic prognostication. I will tell you that, usually federal funders are really great about going back and doing, budget changes once you get the grant. I think within 10% you can make budget changes across the board without letting them know. But although I typically do if I'm moving some stuff around. But if you have grossly need to change something, or a need has changed, or you need to work with something, this budget can be changed. So just be aware that most federal funders are fairly good to work with. I haven't met a federal funder yet it's not good to work with in terms of budget, because they know that circumstances change. So they understand that this is a prognostication type of thing. You're trying to think out into the future and determine what your needs are. So, just know that most of them will work with you. I won't promise all, but most of the ones that I've worked with have been really great. Once you develop that budget, you're going to write a budget narrative as well. So you're going to describe how you come up with all those costs and all that good stuff. So be realistic with capacity limits. Over-promising can impact service quality. So, if be aware of what you can do and how much it takes to actually do something, because you may not, if you overstretch your budget, you may not be able to make an impact like you promised in your grant application. Estimate the demand for your services. Overestimating demand can cause your cost to be too high for the services provided. So, just be realistic and take some time with that. They prefer very specific. I provide as much information as I can in the budget and how I came up with numbers. So, how do I figure out my travel? The local mileage for a project director. So 100 miles a month at 27 cents per mile at 12 months, that's how I came up with that number. Supplies, pencils, and pens, or, here's an example how, I did, salaries for director, project manager, environmental scientist 3, the hourly rate versus the hours they're going to spend on this project. So if you just leave it sort of at the fuzzy, we're going to spend $16,000 on personnel and salaries. Well, that doesn't really tell me much. It doesn't tell me who's on here, who's going to be doing the bulk of the work. Is it the director? Is it internal policy analyst? We just don't know. So they like to provide, within reason, within your real estate for describing it in the budget, provide as much information as you can. And here's an example of a budget chart from, I think it's, you know, this is actually from a brownfield type of grant. So personnel, fringe, contractuals, travel, supplies, equipment, and, you know, the totals. So it's a fairly straightforward sort of budget chart. You know, and here's, I work and, you know, in that previous one, I would have done the, you know, all the explanation down below. There are times where I've actually worked some of the tables into the chart itself, just to sort of give them an idea. You know, and here's an area. See, there's travel, equipment and supplies and travel. I could have taken those rows out and scored some more room for other verbiage too. So, but these are just ways that you can sort of communicate your budget. You know, they will likely have a format within your RFP that you have to follow anyway, but this is just sort of a sample of what we do. So developing your budget narrative. This is a chance to relate your budget back to your objectives, provide that detailed breakdown of costs. You're going to provide sufficient detail so the reviewer understands how various items were calculated. This is where if you are hiring a new employee, you're going to talk about that and how much money you're going to spend toward that, and if there are plans to carry this employee past the grant period. You know, it's just this sort of seed money, and, you know, we plan to raise funds by this, this, and this to, you know, keep them on the payroll longer. And explain any unusual costs. So I was working with a group, I did one of these classes down in the Madisonville area a couple years ago, and one of the folks that came to the workshop was talking about they were writing for some sort of public safety grant, and they needed to buy a new mascot, you know, for their police. I think it was Sparky. The mascot was named Sparky, and he apparently was a fire safety mascot, and he'd gotten to the point where Sparky, the current Sparky outfit, was so scary that he scared more children than educate children. So they were asking for something a little bit off, you know, so, you know, you don't expect, you know, to be asked for a Sparky outfit. But anyway, so if there's something weird there or unusual, such as a mascot uniform as part of your public outreach campaign, you know, that's the type of stuff that you need to sort of put out there. Match and cost share. Most federal grants have a cost share. There's some brownfields that, you know, if you're writing for an assessment grant, it has no match whatsoever. It's free money. It's great. But most of them have like a 20% cost share or a match. Be aware that most cost share can't be matched by other federal funds. The exception are CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds. Those can be used as federal match on other federal funds. Match can be in kind. A lot of our brownfield folks will say that match should never be a barrier for anybody applying. So it could be space rental, it could be use of equipment, money from partners, volunteer hours. Just be ready to put a price tag on what your match is, whatever, you know, equipment use it is, or, you know, just be able to describe how it makes it to that level of match. Be aware that cost share on many grants is calculated on total program costs. That's a very specific, you know, thing there. It's not just 20% of a particular amount, it's 20% of the total program costs. If you aren't sure, call the funder, and they usually put some sort of, you know, example in the verbiage, but it's not straight math like you think it would be. So if you want to apply for a $150,000 grant that has a 10% match on total programmatic costs, you'd think your match is $15,000. But it's not. It's actually 16,667. So your, you know, your match is a little bit different there. So you're going to divide the total amount by the percentage of the project to be funded. So 150,000 divided by 0.9 for a 10% match. that gives you a total project cost of $166,667. So, you know, it's actually, you know, $16,667. So just be aware that it is total programmatic cost. Now, some of them, brownfields is just straight 20%. You know, so it is the, you know, the previous easy math, but be careful what they ask for in that. There's actually, there used to be, and I'll have to talk to my brownfield staff. There used to be, and I think you could probably Google one anyway, on a worksheet on how to calculate federal match, because it's a little bit different, but just be aware. Other notes about cost share. Many grants require cost share to be done during the grant period, so it can't happen prior or post. It has to be concurrent with your grant. And they might have restriction on what activities are allowable costs. So make sure, once again, to read that RFP. Make sure your budget columns add up. Like I said, I will never review them and read them, but there are other reviewers that will. You can only get indirect costs from federal grants if you have a negotiated indirect cost agreement. So just be aware of that as well. You will know if you have one. We have one with the EPA. A lot of a lot of local governments do as well. Even if they don't ask for in-kind, you may want to throw out that you have in-kind resources committed to a project. It shows a commitment by the organization or other organizations. You may not need to include it in a chart, but it might be something to, you know, mention that, you know, on top of all this, we've got this, this, and this committed to this project to make it successful. Once again, watch out for those webinars regarding each of those individual grants. It's a great place to find out how much they usually fund. They might have a funding range in there, and they may not hit that top funding range. It may actually, in, you know, all reality, you know, so they have, you can ask for up to $160,000, but we typically fund between $1 and 120. So sometimes those webinars can help, you know, understand where they actually are in funding. As I mentioned, budgets are not etched in stone. Many times they're flexible after getting the grant. EPA allows us to move up to 10% without notifying the project manager, and flexible when we need to move more. Oftentimes in federal paperwork, you can make those changes. You do have to go back and revise. They have something called the 424A and a budget justification worksheet. You might have to resubmit those if you're doing more than a 10% change, but it's really not that bad of a process. Once again, here's our brownfield resources. I think there's a budget sheet in there, and I apologize if there's not. If not, we can probably Google one, or I can find it where it used to be. But anyway, so questions. This rounds out the whirlwind brownfield grant writing basics. Like I said, if we were in person, we'd be doing, would have been a little bit longer presentation, and we would have been doing a little bit of a grant review exercise here. So, you know, maybe someday we can meet in face to face and do those fun things. But questions at this point, Lindsay?
I do not see any questions in the chat right now, but we'll give people a second to type them in.
Okay.
Oh, it looks like we've got one here. Oh, so Terry Thompson asks, will we be getting an email address to ask questions for us assistance in the future? So the presentations should all have a contact list at the end of them, but Amanda, would you like to speak more to that?
Yes, the presentation will have contacts at the end. One easy one you know, and so you don't have to worry about trying to spell Lefevre or Eiseminger. Lynn's last name's fairly easy. You can always email us at envhelp. That's like environmental, envhelp@ky.gov. And you can reach any of our compliance assistant staff. And that includes our brownfield program staff. So in all, you know, and if you can't remember, you know, our names or exactly what program we're at, we're always at enbhelp@ky.gov.
Wonderful. And I think that that's all we have.
All right. Well, thank you all. Like I said, I wish this could have been done in person because I love the grant review exercise. But at this point, I will turn it over to the fantastic brownfield staff, Eric and Lynn, to talk to you a little bit about brownfield grants and how you might be able to take advantage of them.
All right, Lynn, who will be presenting first, you or Eric?
I'll start. Okay, are you able to see the screen?
Looks great.
We'll go ahead and get started then. So thank you, Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. This next session is gonna finish us out between what Eric and I have to provide. We're gonna talk about brownfield grant opportunities that are open right now and available for applying for, and just kind of focus in that area because many of you represent the Main Street program. You share a lot of the same goals that the brownfield program shares. Our goals being to redevelop and revitalize communities. So I'm gonna kind of jump in and talk about state funding opportunities and federal funding opportunities specific to brownfields. And then Eric's gonna kind of follow up with more information on EPA grants. Amanda did provide an overview earlier on about brownfields redevelopment, but just to reintroduce the subject, the goal of redevelopment is to remediate and redevelop sites to, sorry, did I lose the screen? Here we go. There we go. To benefit the community and improve environmental quality. Those are the main two objectives of redeveloping brownfields. So, for example, all about turning brownfield or problem properties, sites that are contaminated or potentially contaminated, into community assets. Vacant or wasted lots in your community could be turned into a community park. An abandoned factory, for example, could be cleaned up and an opportunity for a new business to come in. Old service station could be cleaned up and might be the right spot for a residential area. Perhaps you need more affordable housing in your community. And a dilapidated building could become a restored, unique building for your area. It might have something unique about it architecturally or historically, and you want to preserve it for your community. And this would be a way to take that building, redevelop it, and then use it again. So how does a community take advantage of these opportunities? Of course, the obvious thing is to take advantage of them through brownfield programs and the resources that we have to provide. You can find these programs at the state level, local level, and federal level. And largely they have all of these technical opportunities, technical support, as well as educational support, as well as helping with liability issues. So these are offered to and available to a wide range of community stakeholders. This includes local governments, city and counties, municipalities, nonprofit organizations, quasi-governmental entities, public and private partnerships, and prospective purchasers. So these program opportunities are available to a wide range of people, and that includes funding as well as free site assessments, which I'll provide a little more information on here in a minute. So you can see in this slide that this covers and kind of follows the stages of the redevelopment process. And the reason I included this is because I think a lot of entities that pursue brownfield redevelopment go into it really not knowing the big picture. So knowing the big picture and understanding the process will help you identify which resources you need and at what point in time you need them. So that's really kind of the whole key to being able to take advantage of these resources that our programs have to provide, just knowing what's available and when you need to use it and when you need to apply for funding, for example, to fit whatever stage you're at in your redevelopment process. The big picture being you start with site identification, basically looking at properties and determining whether or not they're a brownfield and whether or not they're even feasible to be redeveloped. So site ID and reuse planning begins the process. And then you go into a phase where you do environmental assessment. So you can kind of figure out if there's contamination and if there is, what kind there is and to what extent. Then you'll go into the cleanup and remediation stage, and then finally work on into redevelopment and beginning to reuse the site. Now this again is big picture, so each of these phases have multiple activities that go on, different people involved, and varying degrees of costs. Now throughout the process at any point in time you can of course use brownfield programs to request technical support, help you with outreach materials, help connect you with the right funding and different sources of funding, show you some of the tax incentives and just opportunities that will encourage investors to look at the sites in your community and consider if they might be able to profit if they redevelop them. So there's opportunity throughout all 4 stages to contact your brownfield folks and get guidance. But specifically for funding, for example, early in the process, when you're just identifying sites or wanting to know what level of contamination you have, that is the point in time you want to apply for an assessment grant. That's the point in time that you want to contact our staff and in fact get a free site assessment, because that is a service that we provide. So a site assessment essentially is also referred to as a phase 1 or phase 2. And basically, again, it's just evaluating the contamination on that property. If there's even any contamination on that property, sometimes they're just blighted areas that that tend to developers don't want to develop because they fear that there might be some environmental liability there. This is the point in time that, again, you want to, at both the state and federal level, look into the funding opportunities. So the cleanup and remediation stage, of course, this is going to be the most costly stage of the process, and there is funding, of course, specific to cleanup activities. So that's when you'll want to target cleanup grants and look into other types of incentives that can help you reduce costs for that particular stage of the process. So remediation can get involved really quickly and be very costly, and that's basically why we have these brownfield programs. That's why they were established. It was to assist communities with this part of the problem when it comes to these types of properties. This is also a stage, and early on too, you'll want to look into whether or not you can get liability protections. And liability relief basically is to encourage redevelopment and ease the purchaser's mind that they know that they will not be on the hook for all the cleanup costs, because they've done due diligence in getting it assessed and figuring out a plan for cleaning it up. So looking into some liability relief is also part of brownfields redevelopment. So going on into talking about the funding opportunities that you have through brownfield programs at the state level, and we're called the Kentucky Brownfield Program, as Amanda referenced. We're with DEP, Department for Environmental Protection, and our program oversees what's called the Cleaner Commonwealth Fund. This is a fund that offers both loans and grants. And right now, there are loans available. They're available until funds run out. So you can, later on today, this afternoon, after this webinar is finished, contact us, give us a call, and we can get you in touch with have you fill out an application and figure out whether or not the property is eligible. So that is an opportunity you have right now. This is a low interest, sometimes no interest loan. Sometimes portions of the interest or the amount borrowed can be forgiven. And these loans, as referenced in, you can see in the name, Cleaner Commonwealth Fund, are specifically for cleanup activities. So we don't have any grants available right now. Again, it's loans that we have, but both are specific to cleanup activities. And this is for contaminated sites with hazardous substances and petroleum, or a combination of the two. I also wanted to kind of plug here, right now we are very actively seeking to do our environmental assessments on petroleum brownfields. So if you have any old salvage yards, gas stations, anything like that in your community that could potentially have been contaminated or still have petroleum contamination on it, then give us a call and we can come out and assess and provide a phase 1 as well as a phase 2 site assessment for you. And that's not necessarily a grant or a loan. It's just again a free service to the communities, but it's something that can certainly help with the costs of redevelopment. At the federal level, you can see in this list here, multi-purpose assessment, revolving loans, cleanup grants, job training grants. So there are a little more variety of funding opportunities, more competitive to get these, but they also have more funding to award. And they can be used for, again, more different activities, not just for cleanup, but also assessment and a number of other things during the redevelopment process. Right now, this particular, these are also referred to as MARC grants for the multi-purpose assessment, revolving, and cleanup. And they are open right now. They actually opened earlier this month, and we'll talk about the timeline here in just a minute. Now, this is an overview. This is a list of all the grants available, but they're not all available on every given year. This year, multi-purpose grants are not available. They are every other year basis. Assessment grants are every year, so those are available. The revolving loan fund is available this year. Cleanup grants, they too are available this year. The job training grants, they vary. However, they were open this year. It's just that they closed earlier this month. So we're going to focus in on the assessment grant, the cleanup grant, and the revolving loan fund so that you'll know what's available right now. So the timeline for the current EPA brownfield grants for fiscal year 2022 is, again, it started right now. It started, actually the announcements came out in September 21st. When they are announced, there's about 60 days that you have to prepare and submit your application. So the deadline for the assessment grant, cleanup grant, and revolving loan fund is December 1st. So here it is, mid-October. This might be a little too much short notice for you, but it's not impossible. You can still try. Having said that, when you think about the grant cycle for EPA, it's really kind of good to start thinking about it in the spring, because that's the point in time you want to start preparing and just getting everything ready for throughout the next few months, so for when you do submit it in the fall. And you can draft these proposals and you can create a framework for your project early on and then tweak it later on. When the announcements come out, because the announcements actually provide you guidelines, frequently asked questions, a summary of changes that you may need to know about, that you may not have that early on, but you can still, they don't change that drastically each year, so you can still do a lot of preliminary work before the announcement is made. Again, December 1, for those of you who are either currently working on your grant or may decide to get working on it this afternoon, December 1 is going to be the deadline. In the spring is when the award winners are announced. And then in the fall of next year, if you're lucky enough to be an award winner, that's when the funds become available. And that's when your project begins. And depending on what grant you applied for, Your project period may be 3 years, it may be 5 years. Of course, throughout this period, you will have to provide you want to get started early. It's never too late. Register early. I can't emphasize this enough. Registration is no small task. It may take up to a month. Obtain your ID number. This is called your DUNS number. I think Amanda went over these, but there's the website for getting that information. Register for an account at sam.gov. Register at grants.gov and create what's called an authorized organization representative. This is the point of contact. This is the primary grant writer. So this is the person who's going to take the lead role in researching, writing, and submitting the application. Now, keep in mind, oftentimes consultants will offer to write a grant for free, and that's fine and well, but be mindful that award projects still require competitive bids. So again, this registration process can take up to a month. It's very important that you kind of get all of these things squared away so that when you go to submit your application, you won't have any issues. These again are the available grants: assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan. This is what available for what is fiscal year 2022. So the assessment grant is a 3-year project. Cleanup grants, also a 3-year project. Revolving loans are 5-year. The assessment grant can be community-wide or it can be site-specific. Up to $500,000 for the community, up to $200,000 for site-specific grant applications. The cleanup grant can be $500,000 to $650,000. And I know that with these grants too, there are some waivers in the cost that is requested, and it's kind of site-specific. If you have a site that's is going to require a greater amount of money, then they might consider a waiver and actually award you more. Cleanup grants are for, again, one or more multiple sites. There is a 20% cost share. Revolving loans, that's really where they provide capital for larger projects. Sometimes these are more so geared for government entities that have large projects going on. And again, the types of activities you can do with these grants, assessment grants, are not only for phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, but you can also do planning, you can do market studies, you can prepare reuse plans. Again, that's just part of the planning process, but it's a very important part of the process. You can even do things such as engage the community and do a lot of outreach during this assessment. Assessment grants are great. They're a great place to begin. And a little bit easier to complete than a cleanup grant because they don't require as much planning and preparation. And they're more flexible. You can use them for a variety of things, whereas cleanup grants are specific to, of course, cleaning up contaminated sites. And that too, at the federal level as well as the state, is for hazardous substances or petroleum. Real quick note on criteria. Criteria being threshold criteria is basically the very basic things that you need to have in order to be eligible. You either pass or you fail with threshold criteria. You're either eligible or you're not. You either provide the information that they request for threshold criteria, or you don't move on to the next stage of the competition. So things such as confirming that you're an eligible entity. Keep in mind that any documentation or responses that they request for threshold criteria must be attached. This is where you'll have to provide documentation for how you're going to involve the community. Threshold criteria also has you demonstrate expenditure of funds if you already have an open grant, and also demonstrate if it's an assessment grant that you have access to the site, if it's a cleanup grant, that you have ownership to the site. Ranking criteria, which Eric will cover a little bit more in detail, is more point-based, and it's where they break the evaluators of your grant application will go by section, and it will be rated or weighed. It's point-based, and basically decide how well you've completed that, and if you've completed it to what their requirements are, but also in such a way that they think your project probably is better than others. So always provide full detail, respond to all sub-criteria, and think EJ, when you're filling out the narrative of your grant proposal, think about communities that we call environmental justice communities, opportunity zones, and these are areas that you'll want to emphasize. Reason being, because there's a lot of interest in cleaning up sites. These are communities that typically are low income. They have a disproportionate amount of facilities. The populations, the people in the community are more exposed to more pollution. So if you have an area, your community is that, and you can justify and show that it has those issues and you have that need in your community, then that's going to really make your application stand out. Here are some helpful resources, including all of these have links. I'll have information here too, contact information for Eric and myself. There are links here for the application for the EPA grants, guidelines, frequently asked questions. Eric will talk here in a minute about tab providers. Tab providers are technical assistance to brownfield providers, and this is at a regional level. They're actually contracted by EPA, and they can provide a great deal of assistance too. There's EJ Screen, which is a great tool that can show you some demographics and environmental issues related with your particular demographics. So I encourage you to get on there. That will help you in building your narrative. Cleanups in My Community, you can reference that to find out some of the brownfields that may have been cleaned up in your area before. It's basically a brownfield inventory of sites that are on EPA's database. Leveraging Resources is an EPA guide that is very valuable and will help you when you're trying to build a narrative to show how you're going to use different resources to fund your project. The Toxic Substance Portal can also be used to show community need, because you can do toxicity profiles. Use that website for that. And in fact, later today, EPA is putting on a webinar at 1 p.m. So if you would like to partake of some of their resources that they have available to help you write these grants, I would encourage you to do that. So jump on the EPA website and get that information. And if you're unable to attend their webinar, this will be, I'm sure it will be recorded, and it will be a link on their website. So it would be a very valuable tool in the future. For assistance with brownfield grants, contact Eric or myself. We can first provide guidance, kind of help you get oriented with your narrative and help you write. We'll review and comment on draft proposals. So if you have a proposal that you would like some preliminary review on, we can help with that. And we can also provide a letter of support that Amanda referenced earlier.
Wonderful, Lynn. We do have some questions.
He will start the next segment.
We do have some questions for you, Lynn.
Yeah.
All right, so Joni Beaver asks, if we have a big project, do we apply for each stage at the start of the project, or do we have to apply in stages? How do you know you can get funds to cover the project all the way through?
Well, this is where the planning aspect is so important, because obviously you won't be able, some communities are lacking in resources and they're unable to begin a project, or they're unable to continue a project until they have the funds. So you don't have to be in a certain stage. You can just now be thinking about what it is your community wants. You might have some sites in mind, but you don't know that they're necessarily available or even if it's feasible to develop them. So an assessment grant, though, can help you make those decisions. So you can apply for an assessment grant before you do anything else. Now, along the way, and as you apply for it, you'll want to do all the background work, create a framework, do your planning, create partnerships, just basically do your homework so that you submit a good application. But you don't necessarily have to be in the middle of that stage to apply.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we have one more. Unfortunately, it doesn't organize them. There we go. All right. Julie Conrad asks, in your experience, can some administrative costs be considered in kind?
I might have to refer that to, I'm going to refer that to Eric. Do you know if administrative costs can be in kind? Or Amanda? Thank you.
Yes. You have to look at your RFP, but usually, any costs that are associated with a project, you can use as in kind. It would probably be project specific, but in my experience, we've been able to do administrative costs as part of that match, because that is a cost for you doing business. So there you go.
Perfect. Let me do one more sweep just to make sure that nobody else has submitted anything while we've been chatting. I think we're all good. Eric, whenever you're ready. Eric, do you have another PowerPoint to use?
No, we'll continue with the one we have, and just to save time, I will let Lynn advance for me. So we're going to talk about some tips and tricks to these brownfield grants, but first I want to thank Amanda and Lynn. I mean, Amanda did great, so after her presentation, I think I'm ready to go write up a grant, just because. And Lynn told you a little bit specifically about the brownfield grants. So this last section, we'll talk a little bit more about specifically what can help. And these tips and tricks are combined from multiple sources, from EPA, from tab providers. So I've kind of put them together. Obviously, these aren't every tip or trick on the book, but there are some that we thought would help. So we put them in today. Okay, it's not changing on my screen. There we go. All right. So you've heard this. This is a little bit of a repeat. Amanda talked about it. So unless you can write a grant that's going to go from 3 weeks out to second in the nation, start early. Lynn mentioned get your plan. So I will mention one thing about having your plan. You need to have a good firm plan when you apply for your grant. However, EPA knows things can change. During the process, you may have some changes. There are ways to get those changes addressed. So I don't want you to think, for instance, if you applied for an assessment grant and you had 15 properties in your community that you wanted to assess, and you itemize those properties in your application, those properties may change, and EPA is aware of that. So I don't want you to think that it's going to be set in concrete the moment you apply. So there is some wiggle room for some changes in there. And I put this in here that I think would help. You should probably set your own deadline to have your grant complete 2 to 3 days before EPA has the final, which I believe is December 1st. So if I were you, I would have that your own personal set deadline of toward the end of November. And I'll give you an example why. We had an incredible application for a grant that was going to stretch across 2 EPA regions and 3 different states. It was incredible. It was going to be a Habitat for Humanity cleanup grant, and working on, I think it's actually a multi-purpose grant. And it would have been great for both region 3 and 4, and for all 3 states. It would have been Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. It was written by a consultant. I reviewed it. It was great. But it came down to the last minute, and grants.gov got sick or had a headache. I'm not sure what happened, but their application did not get submitted in time. And they were working feverishly up till 11:59 p.m. on the night of the deadline, they could not get that application in. So don't let yourself get in that situation and go through all this work and do all the headaches to get it set, get your good application, wait to the last minute, try to submit it and find out it won't work. So give yourself a couple days to get that in the system. If it doesn't work, you can contact EPA and say, hey, I'm trying to get this in, and you have a little bit of time to get the problems fixed. Okay. All right, you've heard about the grants guidance document. Use that document. It doesn't matter if you've written successful grants in other places, use their document. I think Amanda specifically talked about the number of applications and the reviewers. You want to make those reviewers happy, not frustrated and not upset. So if you use their guidance, actually write your grant in the same order as that grant guidance document, you'll make it a lot easier for that reviewer, because basically what they'll do is they'll look at the grant guidance, and then they're going to look at what you wrote, and they'll do that section by section. That's also, by the way, how we in our Kentucky Brownfield staff will review your grant if you send it to us for review. That's also how your tab providers will review your applications if you send it to them. So when you write it, make sure that you are writing it section by section based on what the grant guidance is asking for in those sections. And I would also say, as you're filling out these sections and writing this application, keep one thing in the back of your mind the whole time. If a friend or family member or someone you know asked you for a significant sum of money, you would have questions about what they're going to do with it and what they need it for. What's the end goal of giving them this money? That's what EPA is looking for. They are looking for that. So as you're writing this grant, you're wanting to explain to them, we're asking you for a lot of money. This is how you can be assured that we will spend it correctly, get the job done, and have an outcome. EPA wants the outcome, right? They're going to give you the money. They want to know that you're going to be able to complete your project and get it to the position you expect it to be in during the grant application. So in other words, if it's an assessment, what's the outcome? That you will have assessed properties and come up with a brownfield inventory for your area, whether it's a region, a county, a city, or whatever. So keep that in the back of your mind. It might help you write that to go, they just simply want to know, what are we going to do with their money? I'm sorry, folks, there's a pretty good delay in us getting this slides advanced. So this is a continuation of the previous slide. Just want to let you know, so we talked about how it's broken down in sections. The sections are rated by points, right? And they tell you what the value is for that section. Every single point counts, but you want to focus on the highest point values and make sure those are the strongest segments of your application. But don't forgo the small value points just because, okay? Every single point's important. Several applications that we've seen in Kentucky have lost by merely a point in the nationwide competition. So you've got to get every point. Even the small sections with few points have to be strong, but pay attention and focus on those large point value sections. Don't leave your sections incomplete, because you'll lose all those points, obviously. And you can't afford to lose even a low value section because you didn't complete that section. So make sure that they're all complete. Make sure they're strong, they get to the point, they're specific, and then move on. Okay, 10 pages is what your brownfield grant is limited to. One suggestion I heard that I liked is, when you are writing this, do not worry about your 10-page limit in the beginning. Write your grant, get the information that you want to relay about your grant from the beginning to the end. Once you have that written, then go back and look at the number of pages you have. If you have 15 pages, then you're going to have to go in and trim those sections down to get yourself to that 10-page limit. But in the beginning, just write it, get your data there. Then in the end, go back and compress it to what's the most powerful words in those sections. I know Amanda said this, it bears repeating, do not reduce your font size to get the 10-page limit. I think Amanda said don't use 10-point font. You really don't want to aggravate your reviewer, okay? Keep them happy. So get yourself to that 10-page limit with normal, probably a number 12 font size. So don't do any tricks like we used to do in high school to try to make a paper look longer by writing bigger font. Just use standard font and get yourself there. All right, a couple of things about the reviewers. You've heard several things about reviewers all day today. They have a lot of applications to review and score. These reviewers that review a Kentucky grant application could be in multiple regions, and we'll have a slide about that here in a second. So make sure that you explain things very well. Amanda showed you the example of the writer who wrote about Eastern Kentucky and the counties out there. That was fantastic. So anyone, regardless of where you were in the country, would be able to understand what's going on. So follow the guidelines, use the readable font. Now, this next bullet point, be clear, concise, and factual. That is actually pulled from the guidance document from fiscal year 21. I put it in here because those words hold a lot of importance. Be clear, be concise, and be factual. Make clear how the money is going to be used and managed, and managing is an important part of that money. They really want to know how you will manage the pot of money you get, and then explain your goals and outcomes clearly, especially the outcomes, because they want to know what their return on investment will be. All right, so this slide was kind of fun to put together. You can see at the top we've got A+ and A. You've got to be on your A+ game. This truly is a competition where an A is likely or may not get you a win for your grant application. It really does need to be an A+. It's a nationwide competition. Every region's involved, and actually here in the last couple of years, more and more tribes and other organizations are applying for grants now. So the pool of people looking for grants is actually increasing. Here we see, and I got these numbers from EPA last year, 429 applications nationwide. There were 154 grants awarded. You can see the numbers below where I broke them out based on the type of grant. For the most part, if you look at those numbers, you are looking at about 1/3 of the applications are awarded. Okay, so that means 2/3 are not, right? So this is where we're saying you have to be on your A game, get your information squared away. All right. No assumptions and don't talk in Kentucky code. All right, we mentioned this earlier. You may have somebody up in Maine, Alaska, Washington. So you could have people that have no clue what bluegrass is, okay? So that's why you need to follow the example that Amanda showed earlier in terms of giving good descriptions on where you are. Somebody from Hawaii may have no clue what Kentucky looks like. They may not know that we have a lot of coal mining. It seems weird, but they may not know that. They may not know that we have swamps in Western Kentucky and mountains in Eastern Kentucky. So horses in the bluegrass, all these things that we assume people around here will know, your reviewer may not. All right. Glenn mentioned we would talk about the TAB providers. TAB is technical assistance to brownfields. These folks are hired specifically by EPA to assist us in what we are doing with our brownfields. Our current TAB provider is ICMA. You can see that their website there is icma.org. They are a new TAB provider. They are still currently building the website. So if you go to icma.org, you might have difficulty finding a specific link or tab to the brownfield program. I found it by searching ICMA brownfields, and it will come up to a search link, which will take you to their brownfield information, but they are still trying to get that put together. I think they were just awarded the contract for Region 4 earlier this summer. So they are getting ramped up and they're getting ready, but they are kind of new. So just be aware you may not see their information on their main webpage, but try to get your applications reviewed by ICMA. It's just another layer that will help, and anybody that can take a look at that and put eyes on your applications will help you in the long run. All right, if at first you don't succeed, be persistent and ask for a debrief. EPA will actually go sit down with you and break your application down and tell you where you're weak and where you're strong. Obviously, if we're at this point, that means you did not win your grant, but you need to be persistent. We have had several applicants in Kentucky that will go 2 or 3 rounds of applications before they win their grant. Yes, that is 2 or 3 years before they win their grant. Okay, so unfortunately, sometimes it may take a while to get where you want to be and to win that grant. But if you need that money, then be persistent. And if you don't succeed, ask for the debrief. If you had a consultant write your grant, then get the consultant with you and EPA all together. And we would also appreciate if you would include us, Lynn and myself, on any debriefs you may have. Hopefully you'll just win and not need a debrief. But if you do, include us, because that simply allows us to help other people in the future, and also maybe you in the future as well. So make sure you get the debrief. And here's our information again. Please send your applications to us to review. We'll take a look at them and we'll make suggestions. Send them to your tab provider, ICMA. Let them make suggestions. The one thing EPA cannot do, once the grant guidance is released, EPA cannot step in and start answering questions, okay? So they are very quiet from the moment the guidance is released up until the deadline, okay? So they can they can answer some questions if you have questions about whether or not you would meet the criteria, but they can't get into any answers regarding your project, your application, how you would write it up. So let us help you with that. Let ICMA help you with that. And here's your information for contacting Lynn and myself. And again, we'll have these slides available, and the recording of this presentation will also be available. Well, Lynn or Amanda, do you have any other further comments to make?
I don't. Thanks everyone for joining us today. The contact information is there too. And also envhelp@ky.gov if you can't remember how to spell our last names or don't know where the slides are. We can always reach us that way too. And happy grant writing, whether it's brownfield or otherwise. We wish you all the luck in the world. We hope this helped you today. Like I said, grants are different depending on the funder. Follow your RFP. Write it tight and you'll be okay. So thanks everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.